He didn't even look up from his bourbon when she walked in. That's what killed her. Not the affair. Not the 7 months of lies. Not the woman's name saved in his phone under a restaurant he'd never taken Mara to. It was that, when she entered his study at 2:13 in the morning, her leather bag in hand, her hands completely steady, Lucian Corvane glanced at her, the way a man glances at a piece of furniture he's stopped noticing. She set her wedding ring beside his glass. He finally looked up. "I won't compete for a place in my own marriage anymore." She walked out. And Lucian, the man whose name made grown men swallow hard before they answered their phones, let her go. Because he had done that thing powerful men always do. He assumed she had nowhere to go. He assumed she needed him. By sunrise, he would understand exactly how catastrophically wrong he was. If this story makes you stop and think, what would I have done? Then you're already where we need you. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because we tell stories like this every single week. Stories about real choices, real consequences, and the people who finally stopped being invisible. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand why that ring on a desk shook an entire criminal empire to its foundation, you need to understand the woman who placed it there. Mara Ellison did not grow up dreaming about power. She grew up in a narrow 3-bedroom house in Evanston, Illinois, with a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry facility and a father who taught 8th grade civics and believed, with a sincerity that bordered on heartbreaking, that institutions existed to protect the vulnerable if you knew how to speak their language. He taught Mara that language. By the time she finished law school at 26, Mara could read a contract the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, not just for what was there, but for what was missing, what had been quietly left out, what someone hoped you wouldn't notice. She was 31 when she met Lucian Corvane at a nonprofit fundraiser for childhood literacies in the South Side. He was 41, already untouchable in Chicago's real estate world, already feared in circles she had no map for yet. He wore a dark suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He brought her a glass of sparkling water without being asked, because he'd noticed she'd been holding an empty glass for 20 minutes while everyone around her competed for the attention of being people with larger checkbooks. That was the version of Lucian she fell in love with, the man who noticed the small things, who could be, when he chose to be, extraordinarily attentive. She learned much later that attentiveness, in Lucian's world, was a tool before it was ever a feeling. They married 14 months after that fundraiser. It was a small ceremony Mara's request. Lucian would have bought out a hotel ballroom, but he agreed to a room at a historic inn on the North Shore with 40 guests and no photographers who worked for gossip pages. Mara's father gave a toast. Her mother cried the good kind of tears. Lucian's best man, a childhood friend named Gregor, who died 3 years later in a manner that was never satisfactorily explained to Mara, made a joke that made the room laugh, but left Mara with a faint uneasiness she couldn't name. She told herself it was wedding nerves. She was wrong, but she wasn't stupid. She was in love, which is a different category of error entirely. The criminal empire did not reveal itself all at once. It never does with men like Lucian. It came in layers, the way cold weather comes first, a chill you can explain away, then a frost that won't lift, and then one morning you look out the window and everything familiar has disappeared under something white and unforgiving. The first layer was the phone calls Lucian took in other rooms. The second layer was a man named Dario, who appeared at their home one Sunday morning with a bruised jaw and a manila envelope, and the specific kind of deference that has nothing to do with manners. The third layer was the night Mara found a number written on a cocktail napkin in Lucian's coat pocket, a number she called out of what she later recognized as a stupidly innocent curiosity, and a man answered who said nothing, breathed for 4 seconds, and hung up. She put the napkin back in the coat pocket. She made Lucian's coffee. She went to her desk and began constructing, quietly and methodically, the first wall between Lucian's darkness and anything she could legitimately protect. That was year 2. By year 4, she had established the Corvane Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to legal aid, workforce development, and educational support for underserved Chicago communities. Lucian thought it was a tax strategy. He signed the documents she placed in front of him without reading them carefully. He trusted her, not the way a husband trusts a wife, the way a man trusts a tool he's never seen fail. The foundation became the most important thing Mara built in her marriage, and Lucian never fully understood why. Because the foundation wasn't just good works. The foundation was relationships. It was the hospital executive who called Mara first when something suspicious crossed his desk. It was the community development attorney who quietly flagged when Corvane-adjacent businesses started appearing in neighborhoods where they didn't belong. It was the network of accountants, civic leaders, and judges who associated the Corvane name with Mara's face, with her credibility, her presence, her genuine investment in things that were real and decent. Lucian's name opened doors because people feared him. Mara's presence kept those doors open because people trusted her. She understood the difference. She never told Lucian because Lucian would have found a way to weaponize the distinction, and she was still, in those middle years, doing the quiet arithmetic of her marriage, adding up what was good against what was wrong, trying to find a number she could live with. For a long time, the number worked. She could compartmentalize that was her particular talent and her particular damage. She could sit across from a city alderman at a foundation gala and be genuinely present, genuinely invested in a conversation about affordable housing, while the part of her mind that never fully rested cataloged which employees were legitimate and which had reasons to be afraid of questions. She could love Lucian. She did love him. That was the part that nobody on the outside ever understood, while also understanding that love was not the same as agreement, and agreement was not the same as complicity. She was not complicit. She made sure of that. Every contract she reviewed had language in it that separated legitimate employees from criminal operations. Every donor relationship she cultivated was clean. Every board member she recruited for the foundation was carefully vetted and completely insulated from Lucian's other world. She built walls the way her father taught her to read documents, not just for what was needed, but for what might someday be necessary. By year 8, she had stopped asking herself the uncomfortable question every night, the one that started with, "What am I doing here?" She replaced it with work, and for a while, work was enough. Then it wasn't. The distance had been growing so gradually that Mara almost missed when it became something permanent. There had been a version of Lucian, the one from the fundraiser, the one who noticed empty glasses and gave toasts that were actually funny, and held her hand during her father's cancer treatment without being asked. And then there was the Lucian who moved throughs like a man who had already left, a long time ago, and simply hadn't informed anyone. He stopped asking about her work, not gradually, completely. One day he was asking, and then he wasn't, and she couldn't identify the specific moment it ended. He stopped looking at her at dinner. Not coldly, it was worse than cold. It was the look of a man whose eyes had found another frequency to be on, and everything in his original range had simply gone static. He worked later. He traveled more. He was polite in the specific way that people are polite when they have already emotionally vacated a space and are waiting for logistics to catch up. Mara knew the shape of it. She'd seen it before in clients who came to her for legal help, women who described a marriage dying not in dramatic confrontations, but in the slow withdrawal of attention, the progressive erasure of being seen. She knew the shape. She simply hadn't been prepared to recognize it from the inside. She found the message on a Thursday evening in October, 14 months before the night she left. She had picked up Lucian's phone to check a restaurant confirmation he'd asked her to. He was driving, and a message had come through. Not hidden, not deleted, just there. The way catastrophes sometimes just arrive, in plain view, assuming you won't look. Tonight was everything. 7 months later, she pieced together who S was. Sabine Calder, 43, divorced, moved in the same social circuit as 3 of Mara's foundation board members, had attended 2 events Mara herself had organized. The affair was not, in isolation, what destroyed Mara's capacity to stay. She had told herself in the 14 months between finding that message and finally leaving that she was staying for pragmatic reasons. The foundation, the employees, the structure she'd spent a decade building. All of it was fragile in ways only she fully understood, and walking away without preparation would leave real people exposed. That was true. It was also partially a lie she told herself. Because leaving is the hardest thing, and knowing you have to do something does not immediately give you the ability to do it. What actually changed was simpler and more devastating. In October of year 13, Mara had a follow-up appointment with her oncologist. It was nothing serious, a benign nodule they'd been watching for 2 years, required another scan, required another conversation. She was there for 40 minutes. She received genuinely good news. On the drive home, she called Lucian. He answered on the 4th ring. She told him the news, that the nodule was stable, that there was nothing to worry about. He said, "That's great, Mara. Hey, did you confirm that dinner Saturday? I need to know if the Halorans are coming." She confirmed the dinner. She drove home. She stood in the kitchen for a few minutes, her coat still on, and she felt something close without fully shutting. The way a door closes in a house when someone leaves, it's not slamming. Just the soft, inevitable click of a latch finding its place. The next 14 months were preparation, not waiting. She began restructuring quietly, legally, carefully. She worked with an attorney in Milwaukee, someone outside Chicago, someone with no connection to Lucian's world, to begin untangling her legitimate authority from the infrastructure she'd built around his criminal enterprise. She transferred foundation governance to an independent board over 3 separate sections, each one completely within her legal rights, none of them large enough individually to trigger alarm. She opened accounts. She secured original documents. She reinforced the contractual language protecting legitimate employees. She created redundant systems so that, when she was gone, the walls she'd built wouldn't immediately collapse without someone to maintain them. She rented an apartment on the 23rd floor of a building in the West Loop. She had kept it for 6 years under a corporate entity that Lucian had no connection to. She'd done it originally as a precaution. The way you keep a fire extinguisher, not because you plan to have a fire, but because you understand that the world is not as controlled as powerful men like to believe. She moved in 3 boxes of personal belongings over 4 separate evenings, always timing it for when Lucian was traveling. By the time she put her wedding ring beside his bourbon glass, the only thing she was leaving behind was the illusion of a marriage that had become, for both of them, a performance without an audience. The night she slept, the rain was doing what Chicago rain does in late November, not falling so much as occupying, pressing itself against every window with a kind of grim authority. She had been in Lucian's study for exactly 4 minutes. He had asked, with genuine confusion more than anger, "Where are you going at this hour?" She had placed the ring beside his glass. She had said what she said, and she had walked out. She did not cry in the elevator. She cried later, in the apartment she had prepared for herself, sitting on the floor beside 3 cardboard boxes because she hadn't bought furniture yet for the bedroom, and the couch was still in the main room, and she didn't want to sit on it because it felt too composed for what she was feeling. She sat on the floor, and she cried for 40 minutes, not for Lucian. Not for the affair, not for 14 years of diminishing returns, but for the version of her marriage that had existed in the first years, before the cold came. For the man at the fundraiser who brought her sparkling water. For the version of herself who had believed, sincerely believed, that love was something a person could build, the way you build anything, with good materials and careful attention and the willingness to keep working when the work got hard. She cried for that woman. Then she got up, because she had work to do, and the floor was cold, and Mara Ellison had never been someone who stayed down very long. By 4:00 a.m., she was at her laptop. By 5:30 a.m., the last foundation restructuring document had been filed electronically with the independent board's registered attorney. By 6:45 a.m., she had sent a single text message to Lucian's lieutenant, Nolan Crew, the one man in Lucian's organization she had always considered something close to decent, though she had never trusted him, the way you trust someone who shares your values, rather than in simply your interests. The text said, "The Foundation Board has new governance documents. Ensure Lucian is informed through appropriate channels. He should not contact me directly." At 7:03 a.m., Lucian called her. She did not answer. At 7:11 a.m., he called again. She turned the phone face down and made coffee. She stood at the window, the city still dark and wet below her, and she thought about the white freesia her mother had loved, and the way her father had always kept a small vase of them on his desk during the school year, because, he said, Flowers reminded him that living things require consistent attention, or they wither. She thought about what Lucian had never noticed in 14 years. She thought about what that cost her. Then she opened her laptop, because the Foundation's emergency transition checklist had 17 items remaining, and Mara Ellison was not a woman who left things unfinished. Whatever Lucian was learning this morning, and she imagined it was quite a lot. She had made sure that the innocent people caught in the gravity of his world would not pay for the failure of their marriage. That was the thing about walls. They don't stop working just because the person who built them has finally walked out the door. Somewhere across the city, in a limestone mansion overlooking the rain-soaked grid of Chicago, a powerful man was sitting in his study with a wedding ring beside his bourbon glass, the phone ringing in his hand, and the first dim understanding beginning to form that the empire he believed he had built was about to reveal to him exactly whose hands had been holding it together all along. He was not ready for what that knowledge would cost him time. Neither, if she were honest, was Mara entirely ready for what came next. But she was ready enough. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The calls stopped at 9:17 a.m. That was the thing that told Mara he finally understood something was different. Not the 17 missed calls. Not the 3 voicemails she hadn't listened to. It was the silence after. Lucian Corvane did not stop calling because he gave up. He stopped calling because someone, probably Nolan, had pulled him aside and explained carefully what the Foundation restructuring documents actually meant. That conversation, Mara imagined, had not gone smoothly. She was on her second cup of coffee, the transition checklist down to 9 items, when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. He's not taking this well. She deleted it and kept working. Across the city, Lucian was standing in the middle of his study, the same room where a wedding ring had been placed beside a glass of bourbon less than 8 hours ago, and he was looking at a document that his in-house attorney, a careful man named Philip Storch, who had worked for the Corvane organization for 11 years, had printed and placed on the desk with the specific body language of someone who would very much prefer to be somewhere else. "Explain it again," Lucian said. His voice was quiet. The quiet was worse than shouting. Everyone in the room knew that. Philip pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of page 3. The Foundation's governance structure was amended 14 months ago. The board became independent. Mrs. Corvane retained her executive director role, but controlling authority transferred to— I know what independent means, Philip. Yes, sir. What I'm asking is how she did this, without me knowing. Philip adjusted his glasses. He had a habit of doing that when he was buying himself time. She had the legal authority to make these changes. The original Foundation charter gave her broad executive discretion. The amendments were filed correctly. All documentation was in order. All proper notifications were. Notifications to who? To the registered board members. At the time, that included herself and 2 external members she had appointed in year 4. Lucian looked at him. She appointed the board. Yes, sir. She appointed the board that then received notification of changes she made. Philip took off his glasses entirely. That is technically accurate. The silence in the room lasted long enough to become its own kind of weather system. Nolan Crew was standing near the window with his arms crossed, and his expression carefully neutral, which was the expression Nolan wore when he knew the answer to a question, but understood that the answer was going to cause damage, and he was deciding how much of that damage he wanted to absorb personally. Nolan was 51, built like a man who had spent his 20s doing work that required physicality, and his 30s learning to be invisible, and he had been Lucian's lieutenant for 18 years. He had attended Mara and Lucian's wedding. He had, on 2 separate occasions, driven Mara to the hospital when Lucian was unreachable once for a broken wrist she'd gotten falling on ice, once during a health scare that turned out to be nothing, but had required a biopsy and 3 hours of waiting. He had a complicated relationship with the fact of Mara's departure. He was not surprised. He was, in a way he would never say out loud to Lucian, not entirely sorry for her. She's been preparing this for months, Lucian said. It wasn't a question. Longer, Nolan said. Lucian looked at him sharply. How much longer? Nolan kept his eyes level. Philip's team found documentation going back 3 years, maybe further. We'd need a forensic accounting team to trace everything completely. Then get one. That's complicated, Phillips said. his voice careful as a man walking on ice he can't see. Anything connected to the Foundation is now legally independent. We can't conduct an internal investigation of an entity we no longer have governance over. Lucian sat down slowly. He picked up the wedding ring from the corner of the desk where he'd left it. He turned it over twice between his thumb and forefinger and then set it down again. "Get me coffee," he said to nobody in particular. Someone left the room to get it. Nobody's until the door closed. "She took the Foundation," Lucian said. "She restructured it," Nolan said. "There's a difference. She didn't take money. She didn't take assets. She transferred governance to an independent board and then filed the paperwork correctly. Legally, she did nothing wrong. She did it without telling me. Yes, for 3 years, possibly longer, the coffee arrived. Lucian didn't touch it. Find her," he said. "I don't mean surveillance. I don't mean just find where she's staying. A phone number. Something." Nolan said, "I know where she is." The room got very still. "How long have you known?" Nolan chose his next words the way you choose footholds on a bad slope. "I've known about the West Loop apartment for about 4 months. I found it when I was doing a routine audit of corporate entity registrations, and I noticed an anomaly in an LLC structure that didn't connect to anything I recognized. When I traced it, it came back to Mara. Lucian's jaw was doing a thing it did when he was working very hard to stay controlled. The muscles along the side of it were moving in a slow, rhythmic way. And you didn't tell me. I told myself it was probably a precaution, a safety measure. Given the nature of our business, a separate address isn't irrational for a spouse to maintain. I didn't see criminal intent, so I filed it as non-threatening and moved on. You made that call without telling me." "Yes." The word sat between them like something broken on the floor that neither man wanted to be the first to step around. "Get out," Lucian said. "To the room, not specifically to Nolan. Both of you. Nolan, stay." Philip gathered his papers with quiet, practiced efficiency and left with the relief of a man who had survived something he'd expected to be worse. Lucian stood up and went to the window. The rain had stopped. Chicago was doing the thing it does after November rain, when everything has that gray-silver quality like city, is recovering from something it won't admit to. "Tell me honestly," Lucian said, not turning around. "Is there anything else I don't know?" Nolan was quiet for a moment. "About Mara? About anything." Another moment. Nolan was someone who valued accuracy over comfort, which made him useful and occasionally inconvenient. "There are things I've managed without escalating, because they didn't require your attention. Whether that continues to be the right call, I'm less certain now." Lucian turned around. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning the Mara situation is going to create ripples. People are going to interpret her leaving as a signal. A signal of what? Weakness. Instability, transition." Nolan let the words land. "In our world, when the picture of stability in a man's life changes publicly, other men start doing math they didn't used to do." Lucian stared at him. "She's been gone 9 hours. Word travels in 9 hours." And it had. By noon, Mara's phone had received 2 calls from people she hadn't heard from in months, both of them connected, through various layers of separation, to interests that competed with Lucian's. She didn't answer either call. She noted the numbers, documented the timestamps, and sent a brief encrypted message to Philip Storch, not because she owed Lucian's attorney anything, but because she understood that whatever was about to happen would affect people who deserved some warning. The first direct approach came at 2:40 in the afternoon. She was in a coffee shop 3 blocks from her building, working on her laptop with a green tea she'd let go cold, when a man she vaguely recognized sat down across from her without being invited. His name was Raymond Fitch. She'd seen him at 2 industry events he worked, nominally, as a commercial real estate consultant, which in Chicago sometimes meant exactly that, and sometimes meant something that operated alongside that in the shadows. She had never liked his handshake. It was the kind that lasted a beat too long and told you the other person was counting something. "Mrs. Corvane," he said, then correcting himself with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry, Miss Ellison." She closed her laptop halfway. "Not all the way." A statement. "I don't recall us having a meeting scheduled." "We don't. This is more of a courtesy call." He folded his hands on the table. He had the careful posture of a man who had rehearsed this. "There are people who want to make sure you know that your position is understood. Your independence is respected. And if there's anything you need in this transition, certain parties are prepared to be helpful. She looked at him for a moment, the way you look at a stain on a white shirt. Which parties? People who've been watching Chicago's development landscape for a long time. People with an interest in stability. He paused. And in relationships with individuals who have the kind of credibility you've built. Mara picked up her green tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway, because she was not going to perform any of the things this man was waiting for: surprise, interest, gratitude, or fear. Tell whoever sent you, she said, that my foundation's relationships are not transferable, are not for sale, and are not connected to my personal circumstances. The board's work continues regardless of my marital status. And if anyone attempts to approach my board members directly, I will involve attorneys. Specific attorneys. The kind who know exactly what kind of consulting work you actually do. She smiled. She meant none of the smile. Raymond Fitch stood up. He nodded once, the nod of a man recalibrating. I'll pass that along. Please do, he left. Mara sat still for a moment, then opened her laptop the rest of the way, and added Raymond Fitch, the time, and a summary of the conversation to a document she had titled, with characteristic precision, Post-Departure Contact Log. It was the third entry in 2 days. The Lucian problem was getting complicated faster than she'd anticipated. She was not panicked. She was, however, recalculating. That evening, she received a call from Nolan Crew. Not a text, a call. Nolan almost never called, she answered. He wants to meet, Nolan said without preamble. No. Mara. A pause. He's not doing well. That's not my responsibility anymore. I know. Another pause. I'm not calling on his behalf. I'm calling because there are things happening that you should be aware of. Things that don't stay inside the lines you drew when you left. She leaned back in her chair. The city was going dark outside her windows. That specific blue-gray Chicago twilight that always made her think of transition, of in-between states, of the moment before something becomes something else. What things, she said. Not on the phone. She thought about it. You're asking me to come in from the cold. I'm asking you to hear information that affects people you've spent 14 years trying to protect. That was the right argument to make to Mara, and Nolan knew it. He'd always been smart enough to know which keys fit which locks. Neutral location, she said. Not Corvane property. Not your home. Somewhere public. The diner on Milwaukee Avenue. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I'll be there at 8:15. She hung up. She sat for a moment with her hand still on the phone, looking at nothing in particular, and she felt the shape of something she didn't have a word for, yet not quite dread, not quite adrenaline, but something in the space between them that lived in the body before the mind catches up. She had left Lucian's world. Lucian's world, apparently, had not finished with her. She went to bed at 11 and lay awake until 1:30, which was unusual for her. She was a good sleeper. She had trained herself to be, years ago, because she'd understood early in her marriage that if she lost the ability to rest, she would lose the ability to think, and thinking was the only real protection she'd ever had. She lay in the dark of her apartment, the one she'd chosen, with the particular quality of streetlight through the curtains she'd selected, and the particular silence of a building that wasn't full of the specific weight of Lucian's world. And she thought about Raymond Fitch's hands on the coffee shop table, and Nolan's voice on the phone, and the 3 names in her contact log. She thought about the 14 months she had spent building an exit, and she thought about the thing her father had told her when she was 17. And preparing for a debate tournament, she was convinced she was going to lose. Preparation doesn't mean you've eliminated risk. It means you've decided what you're willing to risk it for. She had prepared. She had decided. She was still going to have to show up tomorrow morning at 8:15 and hear what Nolan had to say. Because the people in her foundation's network, the workforce development coordinators, the legal aid attorneys, the community organizers who showed up every week because the institution she had built had given them something to show up. For those people had nothing to do with her marriage and everything to do with why she had built walls in the first place. She slept at 2 a.m. At 6:30 her alarm went off. At 8:15 exactly, she walked into the diner on Milwaukee Avenue. Nolan was already there. He had coffee. He looked like a man who hadn't slept at all, which was different from a man who was tired. Tired is a physical state. What Nolan had was the particular hollowness of someone carrying information that has weight. She sat down. She ordered coffee from the server, who appeared immediately and then disappeared with the professional discretion of someone who understood that the two people at this table were not there for breakfast. "Tell me," she said. Nolan wrapped both hands around his mug. 3 days before you left, a man contacted one of our legitimate building managers. Not violently, just made contact. Asked about lease structures for 2 of the South Side properties. The building manager thought it was a commercial inquiry and passed it up through normal channels, which meant it landed on my desk without being flagged as unusual. And now? Now I've traced the contact back through 2 shell registrations to a financial services company that I believe is connected to a man named Victor Rourke. Mara set down her coffee cup. The name was not new to her. She had encountered it twice in foundation work, once as a donor who had been quietly redirected away from a board position because her due diligence had turned up associations she didn't like, and once as the background presence in a legal dispute involving a community development organization that had eventually collapsed in a way that benefited nobody except the real estate entity that subsequently purchased its property assets. "What does Rourke want with Lucian's buildings?" she said. "I don't think he wants the building specifically." Nolan looked at her steadily. "I think he wants what came attached to the buildings, the contracts, the municipal relationships, the zoning histories." He paused. "The charitable relationships." Mara felt the cold arrive without temperature. The specific internal cold of understanding something you were hoping was still deniable. "He wants the foundation network," she said. "He wants the credibility it represents, the access it provides, the cover it can offer." Nolan's jaw tightened. "And because you're no longer standing inside the Corvane structure, Rourke may believe the Foundation's network is now in play. It isn't. I know that. You know that. Rourke may not care. Men like Rourke don't typically wait to find out whether something is available. They create the conditions that make it available." Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside, Milwaukee Avenue was doing its morning thing: delivery trucks, commuters, the specific energy of a city that doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. "Who else knows about this?" she said. "On our side?" "Me, and now you." He hesitated. "I haven't told Lucian about Rourke specifically. I've told him there are competitors moving, which he's interpreting as standard opportunism following your departure. And Rourke's approach to the building manager? Lucian knows someone made contact. He doesn't know who, or why I think it connects to something larger." Mara stared at him. "Why haven't you told him?" Nolan was quiet for a moment. "Then, because when I tell Lucian about a threat, his first instinct is violent. And a violent response to Victor Rourke, a man with legitimate facing business interests and connections to federal financial regulators, would be catastrophic. It would be the match Rourke needs to light the entire structure on fire legally. So you came to me. You think differently than he does." "Nolan." Her voice was flat, not angry. Something harder than angry. "I left. I restructured the foundations specifically to create distance between me and everything associated with Lucian's world. I did that carefully, and I did it legally, and I did it because the alternative was spending the rest of my life holding something together for a man who never once asked what it cost me." Nolan said nothing. "And now you're sitting here telling me that a man I've never met directly is planning to use the work I spent 14 years building as a vehicle for financial crime." "Yes," Nolan said. "That's what I'm telling you." The coffee was good, strong. She focused on that for exactly one breath. "Then, what does Rourke actually need from the Foundation to make this work?" Nolan reached into his jacket and placed a folded document on the table. He slid it toward her without speaking. It was a summary, his handwriting, tight and precise, of what his research had produced in the past 4 days. Shell company registrations, contact patterns, a name she didn't recognize, Graham Sorrell, and a strategy that was, she had to admit as she read it, considerably more sophisticated than she'd expected. Rourke wasn't planning to steal the Foundation. He was planning to corrupt it. He intended to manufacture a challenge to the independent board's legitimacy using documentation irregularities, possibly fabricated, and introduce a competing governance structure through a legal process that would be messy enough and prolonged enough to give his associated entities time to pose as legitimate. partners, stepping in to stabilize a troubled organization. During that window, the Foundation's existing relationships, the hospital executives, the community development attorneys, the civic leaders who trusted Mara's name, could be systematically approached under the Foundation's banner, introduced to Rourke-adjacent financial products, and enrolled in networks that would be very difficult to exit cleanly once inside. It was elegant, in the way that very ugly things are sometimes elegant. Mara read the summary 3 times. She folded it and placed it in her bag. "How long do we have?" she said. Nolan's expression answered before his words did. "Sorrel made 2 contacts last week that I know of. I think Rourke expected your departure to create more immediate chaos inside Corvane's structure. When it didn't, when the Foundation continued operating. Normally he may have realized that you prepared better than he expected, which means his timeline may accelerate. He'll move faster because I left cleanly. Ironic. Yes." Mara stood up. She left money on the table without counting it, which was a thing she never did. She always counted. Always left the exact amount plus a reasonable percentage, and the fact that she didn't do it now told Nolan something about the state she was actually in beneath the controlled surface. "I need 48 hours, she said. "To do what?" She looked at him. "To think. Then. And to decide whether what I'm about to have to do is something I can actually bring myself to do." Nolan didn't ask what that meant. He was smart enough to have a reasonable guess, and smart enough to understand that asking would only produce an answer that made him responsible for it. Mara walked out of the diner. The morning air hit her like cold water, clean, sharp, demanding full presence. She stood on the sidewalk for exactly 2 seconds. Then she started walking. She walked 6 blocks before she stopped. She had her phone out. She was looking at a contact she hadn't called in over a year. A contact that existed in her phone, under a name that meant nothing, D. Larkspur, but connected to an attorney named Dana Hewell, who had spent 12 years as a federal organized crime prosecutor before moving into private practice, and who had done quiet consulting work for Mara 3 years ago, when Mara had been trying to understand the legal geography of Lucian's criminal enterprise well enough to build defenses around it without stepping inside it. Dana had told her then, in a conference room in Milwaukee, that smelled of old carpet and good coffee. "If this ever becomes something larger, you'll know when. And when you know, call me before you do anything." Mara stood on a sidewalk on a November morning, 6 blocks from a diner, where she'd just learned that everything she'd built was under attack from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. And she thought about 48 hours. And she thought about the Foundation's board members, who had no idea what was coming. And she thought about the community organizations that depended on relationships she had spent over a decade making legitimate. And she thought about Lucian, not about love, not about marriage, not about any of the things that had broken between them over 14 years. She thought about him the way you think about a variable in an equation, a factor that has consequences, whether you account for it or not. She thought about what Rourke needed to execute his strategy, and she thought about what it would take to stop him, and she thought about the part of that equation that she couldn't complete alone. She called Dana Hewell. It rang twice. "Mara," Dana said. Not a greeting. More like confirmation. Like she'd been expecting the call. "You said I'd know when," Mara said. A pause. "Yes, I know when." Another pause. Longer. In the background, Mara could hear the particular ambient sound of a professional environment, shifting to quiet, a door closing, someone prioritizing. "Tell me everything," Dana said. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out, 'cause you think it makes you look bad." Mara started talking. She talked for 31 minutes without stopping, standing on that sidewalk while Chicago went about its morning around her. And by the time she finished, the sky had moved from gray to something that wasn't quite blue, but was trying. Dana asked 2 questions, both precise. Both pointed at the part of the story that Mara had told with the most care, the part about the Foundation documents, the restructuring, and whether any element of it could be construed, even in bad faith, as having anticipated a criminal investigation rather than having protected against one. Mara answered honestly. She had always answered Dana honestly. It was the only way the relationship was worth having. "All right," Dana said. "Here's what I need you to understand right now before we talk strategy. If Rourke is as far along as your contact suggests, then this is already a federal matter in waiting. The question is, Whether you control when it becomes active or whether Rourke does. I want to control it. Then you're going to have to give me something to work with. What kind of something? The kind that lives inside Lucian Corvane's organization, Dana said. The kind that makes federal investigators interested in Rourke, specifically, rather than in the Corvane network generally. The kind that a man like Lucian would have to choose to provide. Mara closed her eyes, one breath. You're telling me, she said slowly, that stopping Rourke requires Lucian. I'm telling you that stopping Rourke requires evidence that is currently inside Lucian's possession. Whether Lucian chooses to provide it, that's a choice only he can make. A pause. But somebody has to ask him to make it. And the only person he will actually listen to right now is the one person who has every reason in the world not to be the one asking. The morning settled around Mara. A bus went by. A child on a bicycle. The ordinary machinery of a city that didn't know or care about any of this. She opened her eyes. I need you to understand something, she said. When I go back to that table, and I mean metaphorically, Dana, not literally, I am not going back into that house. I am not doing it to save his empire. I'm not doing it to save our marriage. I'm not doing it because I forgive him, or because I want him to forgive me. I know, Dana said. I'm doing it because 43 people work for that foundation, and 112 organizations rely on our relationships, and none of them have anything to do with what Lucian and I failed at. I know, Dana said again, quieter this time, and I need you to make sure that whatever I bring to this conversation with Lucian, whatever I have to say to get him to cooperate with federal investigators, none of it comes back on me. None of it creates liability for the foundation. None of it can be used to suggest I was complicit in anything I spent 14 years working to stay clean of. That, Dana said, is exactly what I'm here for. Mara exhaled. Okay, she said. She stood there a moment longer. The city moved around her. A November morning, cold enough to see breath. She could see hers in small, steady clouds, which she found oddly reassuring proof that she was here, present, breathing, functional. Then she took out her phone and dialed a second number. It rang once. I need to see you, she said when Lucian answered. His voice on the line was raw in a way she hadn't heard from him in years, stripped of the performance he usually kept running. She recognized it. It was what he sounded like when he was genuinely afraid. When he said, today, neutral ground. I'll send you an address. A pause. Mara? Don't, she said. Not yet. There's something happening that's bigger than what broke between us, and I need you to be able to hold those two things separately for a few hours. Can you do that? Another pause longer. She heard him breathe. Yes, he said. She believed him. She hated that she still could. She hung up and sent him the address of a conference room she'd reserved, under a name that meant nothing, a clean, anonymous room in a building that belonged to neither of them, and then she put her phone in her pocket and stood for one more moment on the cold sidewalk. Everything that had broken between her and Lucian's was still broken. She wasn't going to him to fix it. She was going because the alternative was watching everything she'd actually built, not the Corvane empire, but her real work, the work that had mattered, the work her father would have recognized as the worthy, get consumed by a man she'd never met, for reasons that had nothing to do with justice or community or any of the things she'd given the best years of her professional life to. She had left Lucian's world, but Lucian's world had not left her the option of being done with it. Not yet. And somewhere on the other side of a decision she hadn't quite finished making, Victor Rourke was accelerating a timeline because Mara had left too cleanly, because her walls had held too well, because she had been, it turned out, too good at what she did for anyone to simply let her walk away from it quietly. She turned and walked toward the parking garage where she'd left her car. There were 48 hours. She intended to use every minute of them. The conference room smelled like dry erase markers and recycled air. Mara had chosen it deliberately, a rented space, in a mid-rise commercial building in the West Loop, the kind of place that hosted insurance mediations and small business consultations, and had absolutely nothing to recommend it, except that it belonged to no one relevant, and had a second exit through a service corridor she'd located before Lucian arrived. She was there first. She was always there first. It was a habit she'd developed so long ago she couldn't remember forming it, arriving early to any situation that mattered, walking the space, understanding the geometry of it, before anyone else entered. Her father had called it preparation. A therapist she'd seen briefly in year 9 of her marriage had called it hypervigilance. Mara called it Tuesday. She had a legal pad, 2 pens, a bottle of water she hadn't opened. She did not have Lucian's wedding ring. She'd left that on his desk. It wasn't a prop she intended to revisit. Lucian arrived 7 minutes late, which for him meant he'd been sitting in a car outside for 20 minutes deciding whether to come in. He was wearing a dark gray coat she didn't recognize, which meant he'd bought it recently, which meant he'd been doing the thing he did when he was emotionally dysregulated, spending money on objects, as a way of asserting that he still existed and had agency. She'd watched him do it for 14 years. A new watch after a bad business quarter. New furniture after a fight he felt he'd lost. New coat after his wife left him. He sat down across from her without taking the coat off, which meant he was either cold or he hadn't fully committed to being there. She gave him 30 seconds. He looked at the legal pad, the pens, the unopened water, and then at her face. "You look like you're about to depose me," he said. "I'm about to tell you something that requires you to listen completely before you respond," she said. "Can you do that?" "You said that on the phone. I'm saying it again, because the last time I needed you to truly hear something I said, you asked me about a dinner party." His jaw did the thing. He looked at the table. "That's fair," he said, which surprised her, and she made no indication that it had. She told him about Rourke. She told him about Nolan's research, about Graham Sorrell, about the shell companies and the building manager, and the strategy to corrupt the foundation from within. She told him about Dana Hewell. She told him what Dana had said about federal investigators and evidence and the specific nature of what stopping Rourke would require. She told him everything in 14 minutes, and she watched his face move through 4 distinct phases: confusion, recognition, anger, and then something she hadn't seen from Lucian in a very long time, which was the specific stillness of a man who has understood it, that a situation is worse than he thought and is processing the full weight of it without the luxury of a denial. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Rourke," he said. "Yes, I've had contact with Rourke. Limited, 2 years ago. There was a conversation about a joint property acquisition that I walked away from because something felt wrong about the structure he was proposing." "What felt wrong?" "The money moved in a direction I didn't recognize. The entities involved were layered in a way that was excessive, even by our standards." He paused. "I told my people we were done with it, and I didn't think about Rourke again." "You walked away from him," Mara said. "Yes, and he remembers that." Lucian looked at her. A long look. The kind that acknowledges something without saying it. "He's not targeting your organization because it's weak," Mara said. "He's targeting it because you refused him. And now, with me gone, he thinks the moment is right. He thinks I'm distracted. He thinks you're broken." The word landed in the room without softness. Mara had chosen it deliberately. Not to wound him, she was past the point of doing things to wound him, but because precision mattered more than comfort right now. And Lucian needed to understand exactly what Rourke was calculating. Lucian nodded once, slowly. "What does your attorney need?" "Financial records. Account structures. Specifically, anything that connects Rourke's entities to the property contact Nolan documented. Dana says if we can establish a pattern of approach, Rourke attempting to access legitimate networks through criminal adjacency, then federal investigators can build a case that focuses on him rather than on your organization as the primary target, and my organization. We'll require a different conversation," Mara said. "One I am not part of. That's between you, your attorney, and whatever decisions you make about your own future." Lucian looked at the table again. His hands were flat on the surface, which was unusual for him. He was typically a man who held things, who needed objects, pens, phones, glasses, something to turn over. Flat hands meant he was deliberately choosing stillness. She noted it without commenting. "I'll get you what Dana needs," he said. "I need it in 48 hours. I said I'll get it." She stood up. "Lucian." She waited until he looked at her. "I need you to understand something clearly. I'm doing this because of the foundation, because of the people who work for it and rely on it, not because of us. I know. I need to hear that you actually know that." He held her eyes for a moment. "I know," he said again. Different this time. Quieter, the way a person says something when they mean it, rather than when they're performing meaning. She picked up her legal pad. "I'll have Nolan coordinate with Dana's office. he said. No direct contact between us unless necessary. Agreed. She left first. She used the main exit, not the service corridor. She wasn't afraid of Lucian, and she didn't want to behave as though she was. In the elevator going down, she let herself feel the specific exhaustion of the last 36 hours. Not perform it. Just feel it, the way you sometimes have to let a wave go through you instead of bracing against it. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. Her jaw unclenched. She breathed out something she'd been holding since Nolan sat down in that diner. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, her shoulders were back where they belonged. She had work to do. The next 24 hours moved with the particular momentum of a thing in motion that cannot be stopped, only guided. Nolan coordinated with Dana's paralegal. Financial documentation began moving through secure channels encrypted, properly notarized, organized with the kind of precision that Mara recognized as Nolan's work rather than Lucian's, because Lucian was brilliant at acquiring things and genuinely poor at organizing records of how he'd done it. Dana reviewed the incoming material and called Mara at 11 p.m. with the specific tone of someone who has found something they didn't entirely expect. The financial structures Nolan sent, Dana said. Some of this is more detailed than I anticipated. Lucian is cooperating, I can see that. A pause. There's a thread here connecting Rourke's shell registrations to a series of municipal bond transactions from 4 years ago. If this connects to what I think it connects to, we're not looking at a financial fraud case. We're looking at something considerably larger. How considerably? The kind of larger that involves a dedicated federal task force rather than a single investigator. Another pause. Mara. How certain are you of the timeline Nolan gave you? Rourke accelerating because of your departure? Moderately certain. Why? Because if Rourke is as far along as this documentation suggests, the 48 hours you were working with may already be shorter. Mara looked at the ceiling of her apartment. How much shorter? I'm making a call first thing tomorrow morning. Before that call, don't talk to anyone new about this. Don't accept any meetings you didn't already have scheduled. And if anyone approaches you, anyone representing themselves as connected to any regulatory or investigative body, call me before you say a single word. Dana, how much shorter? A pause that was one breath too long. I don't know. That's what worries me. Mara slept 4 hours. At 7 a.m., she was at her desk, in the Foundation office, the real office, the one on the 14th floor of a building in the South Loop that had her name on the door, and 3 staff members who arrived each morning at 8:30 and genuinely believed in what they were doing, going through the board communications. From the past week, with the specific attention of someone looking for irregularities they hoped not to find. She found 2. The first was a message to one of her board members, Carla Weston, from an entity describing itself as a strategic partnerships advisory firm based in Wilmington, Delaware. The message expressed interest in exploring collaborative opportunities and included language about the Foundation's upcoming grant cycle that was specific enough to indicate the sender had access to information that was not publicly available. The second was a calendar invitation, declined, thankfully, by the board member who received it to a lunch meeting with a representative of something called Sorrell Meridian Consulting, Graham Sorrell. He was already inside the edges of her network. She printed both items, placed them in a folder, and called Dana. Dana's phone went to voicemail. She called Nolan. He answered on the first ring, which told her he hadn't slept either. I know, he said before she could speak. I just saw the same thing. Sorrell sent a contact to 3 board members, not 1. 3, Carla Weston, David Park, and Renata Gilles. Mara was quiet. Renata Gilles had been on the board for 8 years. She was a retired hospital administrator, with a reputation for integrity that was, in Mara's assessment, completely genuine. She was also, at 71, someone who might not immediately recognize the specific shape of an approach like this one. Has anyone responded? Mara said. Weston declined. Park hasn't replied. Renata. A pause that had weight in it. Renata replied to acknowledge receipt and said she'd be happy to discuss opportunities to expand the Foundation's reach. The cold arrived again. Different this time. Sharper. When? Yesterday afternoon. While I was meeting with Lucian. Yes. Mara stood up from her desk and walked to the window. 14 floors up, the city was going about its morning, with total indifference to the crisis forming inside this particular office. Nolan, she said carefully. How did Sorrel know Renata specifically? Of the 3 board members, she is the least visible publicly. Her contact information is not on the Foundation's website. Her name appears in 2 annual reports and 1 press release from 6 years ago. A silence. Nolan. I don't know. He said, but his voice had shifted slightly, not lying but not complete either. The specific register of a man who has an idea he hasn't yet verified and doesn't want to present an unverified idea to someone who will immediately follow its implications. Somewhere he might not be ready to go. Who else knew Renata's direct contact information? Mara said. It would have been in the Foundation's internal board directory, which is not public. No. Which means someone with access to internal Foundation documents provided it to Sorrel. She turned from the window, or to Rourke, or to whoever Sorrel works for. Another silence. Longer. I'm coming in, Nolan said. No, don't come to the Foundation office. Meet me at, she thought. Not the diner? Not anywhere she'd been in the past 48 hours. The parking structure on Aberdeen. Level 3. 1 hour. She hung up. She stood in her office for approximately 90 seconds, which was how long it took her to do the thing she did when the situation required it compartmentalize the emotional response, which was considerable, and focus on what she actually knew versus what she was inferring. What she knew, Sorrel had accessed non-public board contact information. What she knew, the breach had happened while Mara was occupied elsewhere. What she knew, the timing was not accidental. What she was inferring, someone connected to Rourke had access to Foundation information that should have been inaccessible. What she was inferring, that access had been ongoing, long enough to be useful. What she was not yet ready to fully articulate, where the access came from. She picked up her files. She told her assistant she had an off-site meeting and would be back by noon. She took the elevator down and walked 2 blocks to her car and drove to Aberdeen, and sat on level 3 of a parking structure with the engine off, watching the entrance in her rearview mirror. Nolan arrived in 9 minutes. He parked 3 spaces away and walked to her passenger window, and she unlocked the door and he got in without being invited, which was fine, because she had invited him implicitly, and they both knew it. He had a folder. She looked at it and then at him. What's in that, she said. Not a question. He opened it, placed it on his knee so she could see. It was a series of communications printed, time-stamped between an encrypted messaging account and a recipient account that had been traced. He explained in the voice of someone delivering news they've been dreading for several hours through 3 separate relay points to a device registered to a holding company. The holding company connected to Tessa Vane. Mara knew the name. She stopped knowing it in the casual way and started knowing it in the sharp way, approximately 3 seconds after she heard it. Tessa Vane, Sabine Calder's closest friend. The woman Sabine had apparently trusted with conversations that Sabine herself had been careless about. Lucian's affair partner's confidante. Tessa Vane was feeding information to Rourke, Marissa said, to a Rourke-adjacent entity. Yes, the connection isn't direct. It goes through 2 intermediary companies, but the financial trail is unambiguous. Nolson's voice was careful, deliberately steady. She's been receiving payments for approximately 8 months. 8 months. Mara looked at the windshield. While Lucian and Sabine were, yes. The timeline assembled itself in Mara's mind with the cold efficiency of a thing that has been true for a while and is only now being acknowledged. 8 months. The affair had been 7, which meant Tessa Vane had been in position before the affair was even fully established. Which meant one of 2 things. Either Tessa had approached Rourke's people after Sabine began the affair and had been weaponizing the information gradually, or Tessa had been placed in Sabine's orbit deliberately as an intelligence asset before any of this began. Does Sabine know? Mara said. Unknown. Does Lucian know about Tessa? I told him this morning, before I came here. Mara turned to look at Nolan. And? Nolan pressed his lips together in a thin line. He wants to handle it his way. What does his way look like? Not good for anyone. Can you stop him? I can slow him down. Not stop him. Nolan exhaled. He's not rational about this particular piece of it. You understand why? Mara understood. It wasn't about the information breach. It was about the affair. About Sabine. About the specific humiliation of discovering that the thing he had done, the thing that had cost him his marriage, had also inadvertently or deliberately opened a door into the life he'd built and let someone with malicious intent walk through it. Lucian was not a man who processed humiliation gracefully under any circumstances. The combination of personal betrayal and professional compromise would be, for him, the kind of thing that bypassed rational calculation entirely. "What has Tessa actually given them?" Mara said. Nolan turned a page in the folder. "Based on the message content we've been able to partially decrypt, Sabine discussed the Foundation with Tessa on at least 4 occasions, specifically about board membership, structure, your role versus Lucian's, the relationship between the Foundation and Corvane entities, the names of major donors, and Renata Gels. Her name appears in one message, referenced as he paused. He was choosing how to say this. As the most accessible board member, the one most likely to respond positively to an approach. Mara felt something happen in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief. It was the specific feeling of watching something you built carefully get handled by people who had no right to touch it. She had met Renata Gels at a hospital board meeting 11 years ago. Renata had been the kind of woman who asked the right questions and listened to the answers and followed up 6 weeks later to see if the thing she'd asked about had actually changed. Mara had spent 3 months getting to know her before asking if she'd consider a foundation board position. Renata had thought about it for a week and come back with 17 questions, which Mara had answered completely, and Renata had joined the board and been, for 8 years, the member Mara trusted most with the complicated judgment calls. And Rourke's people had identified her as accessible, as a vulnerability. "I need to talk to Renata," Mara said. "Agreed, today." Before she responds further to Sorel, "Agreed. And I need to know," she stopped. Nolan waited. "I need to know whether the information Tessa gave them is enough for Rourke's to challenge the board's legitimacy. The governance documents, whether the information about how I restructured the foundations, the details Sabine might have known, that I might have mentioned in passing over the years in contexts that felt safe, whether any of that gives Rourke's lawyers something to work with." Nolan was quiet for a moment. It was the quiet of someone who has already asked this question and received an answers they weren't pleased with. "Philip thinks there might be a narrow window," he said. "Not because you did anything wrong. Because the restructuring happened during a period when Lucian could theoretically could have an attorney argue that you had a conflicted interest in removing his governance authority. The affair provides," he started again. "The affair provides a narrative, Mara, a competing narrative that the restructuring was retaliatory rather than administrative." The word hit her like something physical. Retaliatory. "I restructured that foundation over 3 years, she said. Her voice was flat in the way things are flat when they are working very hard not to be something else. "I began before I found the message, before I had any confirmed knowledge of the affair. The timeline is documented." "I know. The documented timeline disproves the narrative." "Yes, in a legal proceeding it does." Nolan looked at his hands. "But Rourke isn't planning a legal proceeding. Not primarily. He's planning a public challenge that creates enough noise and uncertainty to give his entities cover during the window between the challenge being filed and it being resolved. By the time your documentation exonerates the board structure, the damage to the foundation's relationships could be significant." She sat with that. The parking structure was quiet. 2 levels below them, a car started and its sound echoed up through concrete. Somewhere nearby, a pigeon was doing something with its feet on a ledge. Ordinary sounds. Indifferent to everything. "He doesn't need to win," Mara said. "No. He just needs to create enough chaos for long enough." "Yes." She looked at the folder on Nolan's knee. "What else is in there?" He hesitated. And it was that hesitation, not long, not dramatic, just a single beat of something held back, that told her the worst part hadn't arrived yet. "Nolan," he turned another page. The document was a property registration. Recent. Filed 6 days ago. A commercial entity new registration, Wilmington, Delaware, which was where they all hid listing as its primary business purpose, the management of charitable foundation assets. The entity's name was Corvane Community Partners. Mara stared at it. "They used his name," she said. "They filed a registration using a modified version of the foundation's name, combined with a Corvane reference. It's not the same entity. It's not legally connected to the foundation, but it's close enough that in correspondence, in introductory meetings, to someone who isn't looking carefully, It looks like an official Corvane charitable entity. She turned to look at him fully. They're already operating as if they're us. 2 meetings that we know of, both in the past week, both with organizations that have existing relationships with the real foundation. Mara's hands were in her lap. She looked down at them. They were steady. She was grateful for that. She wasn't sure how, physiologically, they were managing it, given what was happening in the rest of her body, but they were steady, and she was grateful. Dana needs to know about this registration immediately, she said. I'm sending it to her as soon as I leave this car. And the organization's Rourke's entity met with I need their names. I need to reach them personally before any confusion about which foundation they're dealing with becomes a problem. I'm pulling that together. And Lucian needs to not go near Tessa Vane. I'll do my best, Nolan. Her voice cut clean and hard. Do better than your best. If Lucian goes after Tessa directly, Rourke's legal team will have a document in front of a judge in 24 hours framing the Corvane organization as engaged in witness intimidation, and every federal advantage we need disappears. This stops being about Rourke and starts being about us. Nolan looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't completely categorize, something between respect and the weariness of a man who has spent 18 years managing a very large personality and is finding that the best tactical mind in the room has never been the one he was technically employed by. I'll handle Lucian, he said. Handle him completely, she said. Not mostly. He nodded. She looked back at the windshield. There's something else, she said. I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. Tessa Vane has been feeding information to Rourke for 8 months. That's a long time to be operating as an intelligence asset inside a social network. If she was placed there deliberately, if this was a planned approach rather than an opportunistic one, then Rourke had a strategy involving Lucian's personal life before the affair began. Nolan was very still, which means someone told Rourke about Sabine, Mara said, or about Lucian's general vulnerability to that kind of distraction. Someone who knew Lucian well enough to identify the specific vector of approach. A long pause. That's a significant inference, Nolan said. Yes, it is. She turned to look at him. Who in Lucian's inner circle knew about his interest in Sabine before the affair became established? Who would have had access to that kind of personal intelligence and a reason to share it with someone outside the organization? Nolan said nothing. I'm not accusing you, she said. I'm asking you to think, he thought. She watched him. Watched the way his eyes moved without focusing on anything visible, the way people look when they're searching interior architecture rather than the room around them. Gregor knew him best, Nolan said finally, but Gregor is dead. Who did Gregor trust? Another pause. Longer. There was a man, Nolan said slowly, on the outer edge of our networks. Someone Gregor brought in for a specific function years ago and who has operated semi-independently since. He would have had enough historical knowledge of Lucian's patterns to identify the vulnerability. He stopped. I haven't thought about him in connection with any of this, because he's been inactive. Peripheral. Name, Mara said. Dario. The name landed in Mara's chest like something cold and recognizable. Dario. The man with the bruised jaw and the manila envelope who had appeared at their home on a Sunday morning 11 years ago. The first crack in the wall between Lucian's darkness and everything else. The first moment, Mara had fully understood what she had married into. She had seen him 3 times after that. Each time he had looked at her with the specific quality of attention that told her he was filing her, categorizing her not as a person but as an asset or a liability, running internal calculations she wasn't meant to see. Where's Dario now? She said. Theoretically retired, Nolan said. He moved to Milwaukee 4 years ago. Minor business interests. No active involvement with Lucian that I'm aware of. He paused. But Milwaukee is where your attorney is based. The silence in the car became something with texture. It was Mara who broke it, and her voice when she spoke was so controlled that it sounds like a different register, entirely lower, stripped of everything except the bare functional architecture of the sentence. Dana Hewell, she said. My attorney. In Milwaukee. She did not ask the question as a question. She stated it as a coordinate. As a point on a map, she was beginning to see the full shape of. I don't know, Nolan said. I am not saying there's a connection. I'm saying the geography is notable. Yes. She picked up her phone. She called Dana's number. It rang. 4 times 5. Voicemail. She called the office number. A receptionist answered. professional and unhurried, and told her that Miss Hewell was currently in a meeting and could she take a message. Tell her Mara Ellison called, Mara said. Tell her it's urgent. Tell her specifically. She paused, choosing the words carefully. Tell her the geographic question is now relevant. She hung up. Nolan was watching her. If Dana's office has been compromised, Mara said, then everything I told her on that phone call yesterday morning, the full picture, the timeline, the federal approach, what we needed from Lucian Rourke, has it. Nolan's face did something it very rarely did. It went uncertain. The specific certainty of a man who has dealt with uncertainty, of a man who has dealt with dangerous situations for nearly 2 decades, and is now confronting the possibility that the danger has been significantly larger and more patient than anyone in the room had understood. If Rourke has that information, Mara continued, her voice still that low-controlled register, then he knows we're planning to involve federal investigators. He knows what evidence we're gathering. He knows the timeline. She looked at Nolan. And he knows that Lucian is cooperating. The implications of that last sentence expanded in the car like something that had been under pressure. If Rourke knew Lucian was cooperating with federal investigators, then Lucian was not just a business obstacle. He was an imminent threat to Rourke's freedom. And men like Rourke, when threatened with federal exposure, did not respond by waiting to see how the legal process played out. I have to warn Lucian, Mara said. She already had her phone out. She was already dialing. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, Lucian's voice and the quality of it told her immediately that something was already wrong, that the situation had already moved without her, that she was already behind by the length of whatever had happened in the last hour, while she was in a parking structure learning about Dario and Milwaukee, and the shape of a trap she had walked into with her. Eyes open, because she hadn't yet known it was a trap. Mara, Lucian said. Where are you right now? A pause. Short but present. My office. Another pause. The Corvane Group building. Is Nolan with you? No. Why, listen to me, she said. Do not speak to anyone new today. Do not accept any meetings. Do not go anywhere without someone you trust physically beside you. And do not, she stopped. She organized what she needed to say. Lucian, the documents you sent to Dana's office. The financial records Nolan coordinated through her paralegal. What about them? She closed her eyes. One breath. I need you to tell me, did those documents include the names of federal contacts? Names of investigators who had previously approached your organization? Any information that could identify who we were planning to involve? A silence that lasted 3 full seconds. Lucian. There was a supplemental file, he said. His voice had changed. Nolan included a contact summary. Context for Dana about which federal relationships already existed, which investigators had prior knowledge of our operations. The parking structure was silent. Nolan, beside her, had gone absolutely still. Who compiled that file, she said. Nolan put it together, but it was reviewed before it went out. Standard protocol. A pause. Mara, what's happening? She looked at Nolan. He was looking back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 14 years. Of knowing him not guilt, not quite, but the specific pallor of a man who has just understood that something he believed was a controlled situation has been in a dimension he hadn't checked, completely out of control for a very long time. Who reviewed that file? She said, and she was not asking Lucian anymore. She was asking the man sitting in the passenger seat of her car. Nolan's mouth opened. He closed it. He looked at his hands, then back at her. And in the specific quality of what was on his face, the complicated architecture of a man who has been carrying something he convinced himself was manageable and has just watched it become catastrophically unmanageable. Mara understood something that rearranged the geometry of everything she'd believed for the last 48 hours. Nolan, she said, quiet. The specific quiet that is the opposite of calm. What did you do? He didn't answer immediately. Outside the parking structure, Chicago moved forward without any awareness of the moment occurring on level 3. Trucks. People. The city's complete indifference. The ordinary texture of a world that does not pause for the moments that change everything. I made a mistake, Nolan said. 3 years ago. A financial mistake. Personal. Not Corvane related. There was a situation, and I needed capital I didn't have. And someone made an approach that I thought was contained. that I thought I could handle as a one-time arrangement and walk away from. Mara looked at him. I walked away from it, he said. I thought I did. But you don't walk away from Rourke's people. You just stop hearing from them until they need something. She looked at him for a long moment. At the face of a man she had, in the limited way that proximity and shared crisis produces, trusted, not loved, not admired without reservation, but trusted in the specific functional way that the people standing next to you in a difficult situation require a baseline of. The contact summary, she said. You compiled it. Yes. And it went through you before it went to Dana's office. Yes. And Rourke's people. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Mara put her phone back to her ear. Lucian was still there. She could hear him breathing. Lucian, she said, assume the financial documents are compromised. Assume Rourke knows about the federal approach. Assume he knows your cooperation timeline. She paused. Get out of that building, right now. Don't call anyone except me. Go somewhere Rourke's people don't know you use. Mara, move now. Talk after. She hung up. She turned back to Nolan. He had not moved. He was sitting very still, with his folder on his knee and his hand flat, and his face doing something complicated that she did not particularly care about in this specific moment, because whatever he was feeling, the architecture of damage he had just revealed was going to require every remaining functional hour of the next 24 hours to address. And she did not have the space to manage his feelings and the crisis simultaneously. You're going to tell me everything, she said. Every contact, every exchange, every piece of information that moved in either direction. You're going to tell me in the next 30 minutes, and you're going to leave nothing out. Because you think it will make things worse. They are already as bad as they can be. The only variable now is whether we have complete information or partial information, and partial information will get people killed. Nolan looked at her. Start, she said. And somewhere in a limestone building on the other side of Chicago, a man named Victor Rourke received a message on a secure device that told him the compromised attorney's office had just received an urgent call from Mara Ellison, that the geographic question had been flagged, that the Corvane network was beginning to understand the shape of the trap, and that the window for his final move was now measured not in days but in hours. And Rourke looked at the message for a moment, and then he made 3 calls of his own, and the thing that had been building for 8 months finally began to move with the specific terrible velocity of something that has been patient for a very long time and is no longer required to be. Nolan talked for 22 minutes. He talked the way a man talks, when the weight he's been carrying has finally become heavier than the cost of putting it down, not with relief, because there was no relief in this, but with the specific exhausted precision of someone who has rehearsed a confession so many times in his own head that the actual words come out cleaner than he deserves. 3 years ago, a real estate deal gone wrong. Personal money, not Corvane funds. He was clear about that, repeated it twice, and Mara, note the both repetition and the fact that it was the kind of clarification people make when they need to believe their own line. A shortfall of $240,000. A man who appeared with an offer that felt manageable. One exchange of information organizational structure, nothing operational, or so he'd told himself, and the debt was cleared. Then 18 months of silence. Then a second contact. Smaller request. Easier to rationalize. Then another. By the time Rourke's network made the explicit ask, the contact summary, the federal relationships, the names of investigators with prior Corvane knowledge, Nolan had been inside these arrangements long enough that refusal had a different cost than it would have had 3 years earlier. He had convinced himself that what he was providing was contained, manageable, that he was controlling the exposure. He had not been controlling anything. He had been managed. Mara listened to all of it without interrupting. She had a legal pad on the dashboard. She wrote as he talked not everything, just the architecture, the dates, the specific exchanges, the nature of each information transfer. When he finished, she looked at what she'd written for a moment, and then she looked at him. The supplemental file, she said. The federal contacts. When did that go out? Yesterday, 4:30 p.m. 18 hours ago. Yes, she calculated. 18 hours was enough time for Rourke to adjust a timeline, to accelerate operational elements, to position people, to make the 3 calls she had no way of knowing he'd already made, in a building she had no way of knowing was already in motion. Get out of the car, she said. Nolan looked at her. I'm not going to have you arrested, she said. I'm not going to call Lucian. I'm not going to do anything to you in the next 10 minutes that isn't related to stopping the immediate damage. But you need to get out of this car, because I need to make calls that I cannot make with you sitting next to me. He got out. She watched him stand on the concrete of level 3 with his folder and his coat and the specific posture of a man who has run out of positions to take and is simply waiting for whatever comes next. She felt something about that, not sympathy exactly, more like the recognition of a human being in an irreversible moment. And then she put it away because she didn't have room for it. She called Lucian first. He answered on half a ring. Where are you? She said. Parking garage off Wacker. I walked. Good, stay there. Do not use your regular car. Is there anyone with you? 2 of my people. Names. He gave them. She didn't know either one, which was either good or bad, and she didn't have time to determine which. Lucian. Listen carefully. Nolan has been feeding information to Rourke's network for 3 years. The federal contact summary he compiled went to Rourke 18 hours ago. Rourke knows you're cooperating. He knows the timeline. He knows which investigators were involved. The silence on the line had a physical quality, like a room-changing pressure. Say that again, Lucian said. You heard me. I need you to call the 2 men with you and determine right now whether either of them has had any contact with anyone outside your direct organizations in the last 72 hours. Don't ask them generally. Ask them specifically about Raymond Fitch, Graham Sorrell, and a company called Sorrell Meridian Consulting. A pause. She heard him moving, heard him speak to someone in a low voice she couldn't make out. Mara. His voice when he came back was different, stripped down to something she hadn't heard from him since the early years, the sound of a man who has stopped performing. How bad is this? She looked at the concrete wall in front of her car. It depends on how fast we move. Tell me what to do. She had not been prepared for how those 4 words would land. 14 years of a marriage in which Lucian Corvane had never once said those words to her, not because he was incapable of needing guidance, but because needing guidance from his wife had been in the architecture of his self-concept, a category that simply didn't exist. And now he was in a parking garage off Wacker, with 2 men whose loyalty he was in the process of questioning, and he was asking her what to do. Call Elias Mercer directly, she said. Not through Dana's office. Not through any channel that has touched Nolan in the last 6 months. Do you have a direct number? I have a card. From the initial approach 3 months ago. I kept it. Call that number. Tell Mercer that your cooperation timeline has been compromised. Tell him Rourke has the federal contact list. Tell him you need immediate protective arrangement and you're prepared to expedite the evidentiary transfer. She paused. Do you know what that means? Expedite? I know what it means. It means today, Lucian. Not tomorrow. Not after you've had time to process. It means you give Mercer everything you have right now, and you trust that the cooperation agreement holds. Another pause. And if it doesn't hold, then you made a decision, she said, and you live with the consequences of it. The same as the rest of us. She heard him breathe, in and out once. All right, he said. She hung up and immediately called Dana Hewell's cell, not the office number. The cell, which she had memorized and never stored in her phone because she'd had an instinct about that particular top of precaution that she was now extremely grateful for. Dana answered on the second ring, and before Mara could speak, she said, in a voice that was professionally controlled, but running underneath it was something urgent and alarmed. I was about to call you. Your office, Mara said, yes. How long have you known? A pause that was not evasion, but was the pause of a person determining how honest they can afford to be in the next 30 seconds. I had a suspicion about my paralegal 4 days ago. I've been verifying quietly. I didn't want to alarm you before I was certain. Mara closed her eyes. 4 days. Dana had known for 4 days. The call Mara made 36 hours ago, the full briefing, the timeline, everything had gone to an office where suspicion already existed and had not been shared. She did not say what she was thinking. There would be time for that conversation later, in a different context. And right now, Dana was still the most qualified legal mind in her corner, and burning that bridge would accomplish nothing except leaving her on the wrong side of the river. The situation has accelerated, Mara said. Rourke has the federal contact list from Nolan's supplemental file. He knows Lucian is cooperating. Lucian is calling Mercer directly right now to expedite the evidentiary transfer. How soon can Lucian have documents to Mercer? Hours, not days. Then we have a window. Dana's voice sharpened into the mode Mara recognized as operational the federal prosecutor gear that never fully went away. The Corvane Community Partners, registration the entity, using the modified foundation name. I filed an emergency challenge this morning with the Illinois Secretary of State's office. We have a 48-hour response window before the registration can be fully activated. 48 hours from when? From 8 with this morning. Mara checked the time. It was 9:47 a.m. We have 34 hours on the registration challenge, she said. Yes. But Rourke will file competing claims on the properties the moment he knows Lucian has moved to cooperate. I need you to do something that I am going to tell you is legally defensible, but is also going to feel like the most exposed you've been in this entire situation. Tell me. I need you to go to your foundation office, the physical office, and I need you to pull the original signed contracts, the incorporation documents, the board appointment records, the original foundation charter, and I need you to have those documents in the hands of a certified courier, addressed to the Illinois Attorney General's office by 10:30 a.m. That's 43 minutes from now. Yes, my office may not be secure. I know. That's why it has to be you and not anyone I send. The chain of custody requires your signature. It requires you to physically handle those documents and certify their transfer. If anyone else touches them first, Rourke's attorneys will challenge the chain, and we lose the evidentiary value. Mara looked at Nolan through the windshield. He was standing exactly where she'd left him. The folder was under his arm. He was looking at the concrete floor. There's one more thing, Dana said. Say it. Renata Gilles returned Sorel's call this morning. She had a 40-minute phone conversation with someone representing themselves as a foundation partnership consultant. She didn't commit to anything, but she shared information about the board's governance calendar, specifically the date of the next official board meeting. Mara felt the cold move through her again. Rourke's people know when the board convenes, and if they file a governance challenge timed to the meeting date with manufactured evidence of structural irregularities, the board goes into defensive mode instead of operating normally, and every relationship in our network sees instability instead of continuity. Mara exhaled. I have to go. Mara, be careful about who you take with you to that office. She hung up. She got out of the car. Nolan looked up. I need your key card, she said. He blinked. What? Your Corvane Group key card. You have access to the foundation building's parking level through the shared corporate credential system. I know because I set it up, and I know every access point in that building. I need your card because mine will flag if anyone is monitoring the entry system and yours is the last credential. Rourke's people will expect to be active right now. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her the card without speaking. You're going to call Philip Storch, she said. You're going to tell him exactly what you told me. All of it. Then you're going to be available to speak to federal investigators when they come for you, because they will come for you. And the only variable is whether you meet them cooperating or defending. She looked at him steadily. That choice is yours, Mara. His voice was rough. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a moment. At the face of someone who had made a bad choice under pressure, and then made it worse by managing it alone, and then compounded it by staying in place long enough to become genuinely dangerous to people who had done nothing to deserve the exposure. I know, she said. She got back in her car. She called a car service, not a rideshare. A specific private service she used for foundation business, and gave them an address 2 blocks from the foundation building and told them 7 minutes. Then she drove. The foundation building was a 12-story structure in the South Loop that housed 3 nonprofit organizations, 2 law firms, and a social enterprise incubator. Mara had chosen it deliberately when she established the foundation's office lease. Visible enough to be credible, busy enough that unusual foot traffic wouldn't be notable, close enough to the city's civic center that her board members could walk to meetings that mattered. She entered through the parking level with Nolan's card. The reacher accepted it without hesitation. The elevator required a secondary code she entered from memories, 6 digits, never written down, changed quarterly. The doors opened on 14. The office was quiet. It was before 9 a.m., before her staff arrived, and the particular silence of an empty office had a different quality than any other silence, the specific stillness of a space that is waiting for the people who give it purpose. She went directly to the filing room, a locked room, biometric entry, 6 cabinets. She had the only biometric registration. She had designed it that way. The original documents were in the 3rd cabinet, 2nd drawers, in a red accordion folder that was fireproof, waterproof, and had been in that specific location for 4 years without being moved. She had checked it every 3 months, not because she expected a problem, but because checking things was how she stayed ahead of problems. She pulled the folder. She opened it on the table and verified the contents against it, the index on its inside cover, incorporation documents, board appointment records, original foundation charter with original signatures, the restructuring amendments from 14 months ago, notarized and countersigned by the independent board members. Everything present, everything intact. She was reaching for the certification stamps she needed when her phone buzzed. Lucian. Text not call. Mercer is moving. Sending team to collect documents now. He says, stay away from the foundation office. Says Rourke has people in the area. She stared at the text. Then she looked at the window. The foundation office was on the 14th floor. The window faced south. On the street below, from this angle, she could see the intersection at the building's main entrance. She moved to the window and looked down. 2 men, standing on opposite sides of the intersection, neither looking at each other, which was the specific tell of people who were coordinating without wanting to appear to be coordinating. One had a phone to his ear. The other was looking at the building's entrance with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who is not sightseeing. Rourke's people were already here. She stepped back from the window. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at her phone. She looked at the door. Mercer's team was coming. But Mercer's team was not here yet, and the certified courier she'd told Dana she would have documents to by 10:30 was also not here yet, and the documents needed her signature and her certification before they could go anywhere, and both of those things required her to be in this room for approximately 6 more minutes. Her phone buzzed again, Dana this time. Rourke filed at 9:52 a.m. Governance challenge, claiming documentary irregularities in the board restructuring. It's filed with Cook County Circuit Court. We have until 5 p.m. to respond with authenticated originals or the challenge stands pending hearing. She looked at the clock. 9:54 a.m. She pulled the certification stamps from the desk drawer. She worked quickly, but not rushed. Rushed hands make errors, and errors in document certification are permanent. She stamped each page that required it. She signed where her signature was required. Her handwriting was the same as it always was, which she noted abstractly as a thing to be grateful for. Her phone rang the car service. I'm on my way down, she said. I need you at the south entrance, not the main. The service entrance on Plymouth. There's construction on Plymouth, ma'am. I know there's construction. Pull to the barricade and wait. I'll be there in 4 minutes. She ended the call. She put the documents back in the accordion folder. She put the folder in the leather bag she'd brought her bag, the one she'd carried out of Lucian's house 11 days ago, the one that had never left her possession since. She went to the door. She stopped. There was sound from the direction of the elevator. Not her staff. They had a distinct pattern to their arrivals, and this was not that pattern. This was the sound of the elevator arriving, and then not moving, which meant someone had gotten in and then held the door or pressed a floor and then reconsidered. She had 2 options. Wait, which gave her the defensive position of the locked filing room, biometric entry, no one coming through without her cooperation. Or move, which gave her the documents in hand, the service exit route, and 4 minutes before her car service, pulled to the Plymouth barricade. She moved. She went to the stairwell door at the far end of the office, used her key, went through. The stairwell smelled like concrete and the specific mineral cold of an enclosed space. She went down 2 floors to 12, then crossed through the shared building corridor to the east stairwell, a route she had walked exactly once before, 3 years ago, when she was familiarizing herself with the building's emergency egress options, which she did in every building she worked in regularly because her father had taught her that preparation was not paranoia. It was respect for the possibility that things go wrong. She came out on the lobby level. Not the main lobby, the east corridor that connected to the building's secondary retail entrance. She walked through it like someone who was supposed to be there, because she was supposed to be there. And the fact that she was moving quickly was the only possible tell, and she controlled that too. Plymouth Street, the barricade, the car service, a dark blue sedan, idling precisely where she'd asked. She got in. Illinois Attorney General's office, she said. Michigan Avenue. Fast but legal, the driver pulled out. She sat in the back with the leather bag on her lap and her hands on top of it, and she let herself feel, for approximately 90 seconds, the specific aftermath of the last 8 minutes, the adrenaline that didn't have anywhere to go, the particular tremor in her hands that she hadn't noticed while she was moving, but was noticing now. The way her breathing was shallower than she wanted it to be. She breathed deliberately. 3 counts in, 4 out. The technique her doctor had given her 2 years ago for managing stress responses that she'd practiced enough to be able to deploy without thinking about it. Her phone rang. "Lucian, I'm out of the building," she said. "Mercer's team just arrived at the foundation. 2 men with federal credentials. They're looking for you. I'm on my way to the AG's office. I have the originals." A pause then. "Are you okay?" She almost said yes reflexively. Then she thought about the question, about the specific quality up, about the fact that it was the first time in this entire crisis that he had asked about her rather than the situation. "I'm functional," she said. "That's what matters right now." "Lucian, where are you with Mercer?" "A shift. Back to operational. His team has the financial documentation, the shell company records, the Rourke account structures. He says it's enough to move on, but he needs one more piece, the direct connection between Rourke and the Corvane Community Partners registration, the entity using the modified foundation name. He needs something that places Rourke personally in the chain of that filing. The registration was filed in Delaware. Yes, through a nominee. But Nolan found something before everything else. He found a wire transfer from a Rourke-adjacent account to the registered agent that handled the Delaware filing. The transfer was 3 days before the registration date. That connects Rourke to the entity. It connects his money to it. Mercer says that combined with the board contact approach through Sorrell and the property manager contact from week 1, it builds a pattern. A pause. He says it's enough to move if we can get it into his hands with proper chain of custody before Rourke's attorneys get a judge to put a discovery hold on the Corvane financial records. When does Rourke's attorney move on the hold? Mercer thinks 11:30, possibly noon. She checked the time. 9 m, the wire transfer documentation, she said. "Where is it physically?" Nolan had it. It was in the folder. The folder Nolan had been holding in the parking structure. The folder that was now, she thought, still under Nolan's arm on level 3 of a parking structure on Aberdeen, along with a man who had just confessed to being a compromised information source and was waiting for instructions about whether to call Philip Storch or turn himself in or simply stand there until something happened. "I need to make a call," she said, Mara. Mercer's people can go to Nolan directly. Mercer's people cannot go to Nolan directly because Nolan's status is currently unresolved, and if he sees federal agents approaching him without context, he will do something that makes everything worse. She paused. "I'll handle Nolan. Get me Mercer's direct number." "Not the office. His cell." Lucian gave it to her. She called Nolan. He answered immediately, which told her he'd been sitting on that concrete level with his phone in his hands since she left. "The wire transfer documentation in your folder," she said without preamble. "I need it at the federal building on Dearborn by 11:15. You're going to take it there yourself. You're going to ask for Elias Mercer. You're going to tell him you're there to deliver material relevant to the Rourke investigation and that your attorney will be in contact within the hour." "My attorney," Nolan said. "You don't have one yet. Get one. You have approximately 40 minutes. A pause. "Nolan, I know what you are right now. I know what this walk across town costs you. I'm not asking you to do it because you owe me. I'm asking you to do it because there are people who have nothing to do with what you did who will be hurt if that document doesn't get to Mercer before 11:30. A silence. She heard him breathe. "Okay," he said. She hung up. The car turned onto Michigan Avenue. The Attorney General's office was 4 blocks ahead. The morning was cold and bright, the specific winter bright that Chicago gets when the cloud cover breaks suddenly, and everything is sharply defined in a way that doesn't feel entirely safe. She called Mercer's number. He answered on the first ring. Federal people with active case files answered on the first ring. It was a tell she'd noted before. "This is Mara Ellison," she said. "I have the authenticated original Foundation documents. I'm 2 minutes from the Illinois Ageezaphon, Michigan. I'm delivering them personally. I need a receiving agent there who can establish chain of custody on site, Miss Ellison." His voice was controlled and direct, and had the particular quality of someone who had been briefed about her in advance and had formed a specific assessment they were now revising in real time. "I have 2 agents en route to your Foundation's office." "I'm not at the Foundation office. I have the documents with me. Send your agents to Michigan Avenue." She gave him the specific address. "And there's a Nolan crew who will be at the Dearborn Federal Building before 11:15 with wire transfer documentation connecting Rourke personally to the Corvane Community Partners registration. He needs to be received and processed before the 11:30 hold window." A pause. "How do you know about the hold window?" "Because I know how men like Rourke operate, and I've spent 14 years watching one up close." She paused. "Is there anything else you need from me in the next 90 seconds? Or can we both focus on the next 20 minutes? Another pause. Shorter. "I'll have an agent at Michigan Avenue in 8 minutes. I'll be there in 2. I'll wait." The car pulled to the curb. She got out. She stood on Michigan Avenue in the November morning with her leather bag on her arm and the accordion folder of original documents inside it, and the city moving around her in its complete indifference. And she thought about the last 11 days, the wedding ring on the desk, the diner, the parking structure, Nolan's confession, the stairwell on the 14th floor, the 2 men watching the building entrance from opposite corners, and she thought about her father and what he would have said about preparation and risk, and the things worth risking it for. She thought he would have recognized this morning, the shape of it, the cost of it. She thought he would not have been surprised that she was the one standing here. The federal agent arrived in 6 minutes, not 8. She established chain of custody at the curb, signed where required, and watched the documents transfer to official possession. Then her phone rang again. It was not Lucian. It was not Dana. It was not Mercer. It was a number she didn't recognize. A 312 area code. "Chicago," she answered. "Miss Ellison." The voice was male, unhurried, the specific unhurriedness of someone who believes they control the situation. "My name isn't important. I'm calling on behalf of someone who would like you to understand that the documents you just transferred are not going to produce the outcome your attorney has led you to expect." She was quiet. The Foundation's governance challenge was filed at 9:52 this morning. Even with authenticated originals, the hearing date is 60 days out. During those 60 days, the Foundation operates in a contested status that will make every significant donor relationship you've built non-functional. Your board members won't be able to commit resources. Your partner organizations won't sign new agreements with an entity under legal challenge. And the man who put that network together for you over 14 years is currently in the process of destroying his own organization to feed information to federal investigators, which means the name that gave your Foundation its reach is about to become radioactive. She listened. "We're not your enemy, Ms. Ellison. We never were. What we want is simple. The Foundation's network, the relationships you built, operating under a structure with adequate capitalization and real organizational support. We're prepared to offer that. Your role continues. Your work continues. The communities you serve continue to be served. The only thing that changes is the governance structure. And Rourke controls it," she said. A pause. "The capitalization would come through entities connected to various investors. The governance, Rourke controls it," she said again. Not a question. Another pause. "There would be shared governance. I'm going to stop you," she said. Her voice was very steady. The kind of steady that is on the other side of something that has burned through fear and come out somewhere, that is not comfortable but is at least honest. "You called me because your employer has just realized that the legal and evidentiary situation is moving faster than he anticipated. He's filing governance challenges and putting people on street corners and making phone calls because he's running out of time, not because he's in a position of strength." She paused. "Tell him the answer is no. Tell him the answer will always be no. And tell him that the next time he wants to discuss the Foundation's network, he should send someone with a law degree instead of a phone number." She hung up. Her hands were shaking now. Not visibly, she didn't think visibly, but there was a tremor in them that she could feel from the inside, the specific physical response of a body that has been at maximum capacity for too long and is starting to present the bill. She stood on Michigan Avenue and breathed and watched the federal agent walk the accordion folder toward a vehicle parked 20 feet away, and she thought, this is not over yet, because the documents were delivered. The wire transfer evidence was on its way to Dearborn. Lucian was with Mercer's team. Dana was filing a response to the governance challenge. But the governance challenge itself stood for 60 days. The voice on the phone hadn't been wrong about that. 60 days of contested status. 60 days during which every relationship she'd spent 14 years building would be asked, implicitly or explicitly, which version of the foundation they trusted, the one under challenge, or the new entity that Rourke's people would position as the stable successor. 60 days was a long time for an organization built on trust to absorb a sustained narrative of instability. She called Dana. The governance challenge, she said. The 60-day window. Is there any mechanism to shorten it? Potentially, Dana said. If the original filer of the challenge is indicted on related federal charges before the hearing date, the challenge can be withdrawn or dismissed on grounds of bad faith filing. The court won't maintain a governance challenge that was filed as part of a criminal enterprise. How quickly can Mercer move on an indictment? Depends entirely on what Lucian gives them and when. A pause. Mara, how much are you expecting Lucian to actually confess? She thought about that question. About what she knew of Lucian, not the version of him she'd been managing for 2 days. The operational Lucian who was running on crisis, and something that might have been genuine remorse, but the longer version, the man she'd known for 15 years, who had built something powerful and held on to it with a grip that was part discipline and part identity, and part the specific terror of men who have come from nothing and cannot survive the concept of returning to it. She thought about what it would cost him to confess. Not strategically, actually. What it would cost him in the place where things cost. I don't know, she said. Honestly. Because if it's a partial cooperation, if he gives Mercer enough to build a Rourke case, but protects his own core operations, the indictment timeline extends significantly. Months, not weeks. And in that scenario, the Foundation's 60-day window becomes a real problem. I know. There's another option, Dana said slowly. If Lucian provides full cooperation everything, not just the Rourke connection, Mercer can move on the indictment within days. The challenge gets pulled. The Foundation's contested status resolves. The network stabilizes. Full cooperation means Lucian's organization. Full cooperation means everything. That's 30 years, Mara said. Yes. She stood on the sidewalk. The November morning was moving into midday, and the light was doing the particular thing Chicago light does when winter is close, flattening everything slightly, making the city look more permanent than it feels. She thought about whether she had the right to ask that. Whether, after everything, the affair, the 14 years of being invisible, the way he'd looked up from his bourbon, with the expression of a man who'd forgotten he wasn't alone in his own house, whether she had any standing left to ask Lucian Corvane to burn down the thing he'd spent 30 years building. And she thought about 43 people who showed up to Foundation offices every week, about Renata Jalal's, about the community organizations that trusted the name above their door, about the legal aid clinics and the workforce programs and the people who had come to those programs because they needed something real and had found it there. She thought about what her father had taught her, about institutions and the people who depend on them. She made a decision. She called Lucian. He answered before the first ring finished. I need to ask you something, she said. And I need you to understand before I ask it that I'm not asking it for our marriage. I'm not asking it for me. I'm asking it for the people who have nothing to do with either of us. Ask it, he said. She asked it. The silence that followed was the longest she'd experienced in 11 days. Longer than the night she left. Longer than the conference room. Longer than the parking structure with Nolan and the folder, and the specific moment when the world had reorganized itself around a new and terrible truth. She stood on Michigan Avenue and let the silence be what it was. And then Lucian said quietly, with the specific flatness of someone speaking from the place where decisions actually live, beneath performance, beneath strategy, beneath the version of himself he'd been maintaining for 30 years. Get me Mercer's direct line. She had already sent it. She heard him look at his phone, heard the small sound of him finding the number, heard him breathe once. Mara, he said. Yes, whatever happens after today. He stopped, started again. I'm not asking for anything. I want you to know that I understand now what I didn't understand then. She knew what he meant. She didn't say so. Call Mercer, she said. She hung up. She stood for a moment more on Michigan Avenue, and somewhere across the city, in a federal building on Dearborn, Nolan Crew was walking through a lobby with a folder of documents that would cost him everything he thought he'd managed to hold on to. And somewhere in a parking garage off Wacker, Lucian Corvane was looking at a phone number that was the end of the world he'd built. And somewhere in a building she couldn't see, Victor Rourke was receiving reports from people on street corners and attorneys on filing deadlines and the voice who had just called her. And he was beginning to understand, not fully yet, but beginning that the woman he had identified as the weakest pressure point in the Corvane structure had turned out to be. The call lasted 47 minutes. Mara knew this because she was still standing on Michigan Avenue when it ended, and she had looked at her phone's screen before answering and after, and the number was 47, and she spent a moment considering what 47 minutes could contain, what a man could dismantle in that window, what version of himself he could choose to leave behind when he finally stopped talking. She hadn't been on the call. It was between Lucian and Mercer, but at 11:44 M. Mercer's office called Dana, and Dana called Mara, and the first thing Dana said was, he gave them everything. Mara sat down on a bench. She hadn't been looking for one her legs, simply arrived at a decision before her mind caught up. Everything, she said. 30 years of operational records. Shell company structures. Financial channels. Names of contacts within municipal government. The property acquisitions. The enforcement side. A pause. He didn't negotiate scope. He gave Mercer blanket cooperation and asked only that the agreement cover individuals in his legitimate employ who had no knowledge of criminal operations. The bench was cold through her coat. The city moved in front of her, a bus, 2 cyclists, a woman pushing a stroller who was also on her phone and managing both with the specific competence of someone who had learned to hold multiple things at once. The Rourke indictment, Mara said. Mercer's moving today. The wire transfer documentation Nolan brought in, combined with what Lucian provided about the prior meeting 2 years ago, and the subsequent approach pattern it builds the predicate. Dana's voice carried something Mara recognized as genuine surprise, softened by professionalism. It's more than enough. Rourke's attorneys will have a federal indictment in their hands before 5 o'clock, and the governance challenge. Filed in bad faith as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Once the indictment is processed, we file an emergency motion to dismiss. Given the circumstances, I expect the court to act within 72 hours. A pause. Mara, the foundation is going to be fine. She sat with that sentence. She had been in motion for 11 days. Actual physical and strategic motion, always moving toward the next thing, the next call, the next decision, the next person who needed something from her. The particular momentum of crisis, which is its own kind of shelter, because as long as you are moving, you do not have to stop and feel the full weight of the thing you've been moving through. Now Dana was telling her the foundation was going to be fine, and Mara's body, receiving this information on a bench on Michigan Avenue on a cold November morning, responded by doing something she had not given it permission to do. Her eyes filled. She did not cry. She had cried 11 days ago on the floor of an apartment next to 3 cardboard boxes, and that had been for something different, something that deserved its own grief. This was not the same kind of tears. This was the specific physical response of a system that has been under sustained pressure, releasing some of that pressure before it's ready to release all of it. She blinked it back, breathed, looked at the bus schedule posted on the shelter to her left, and read the route numbers without registering them. Just something to look at while her eyes returned to normal. Thank you, Dana, she said. There's going to be a deposition, Dana said. Your role in the foundation restructuring will need to be fully documented. The timeline, the legal basis, the independence of the board appointments. It will be thorough, I know, and there will be questions about what you knew and when, about Lucian's operations, about the line you maintained. I've been maintaining that line for 14 years, Mara said. I have the documentation. I know you do. A pause. I also need to say, and this is the last thing, and it's not legal advice. It's just something I'm saying as a person, what you did this morning. The building, the documents, the chain of custody. That was not a small thing. Mara was quiet. A lot of people in your position would have let someone else take that risk, Dana said. The chain of custody required my signature, Mara said. Yes. Dana let a pause sit. I know, she hung up. Mara sat on the bench for 3 more minutes. She counted them. Not because she needed to, but because she had spent 11 days making decisions in pressed timeframes, and she wanted to exercise the specific luxury of doing nothing for a defined and finite period. Then she stood up and went to find coffee. By 2:30 that afternoon, Rourke's lead attorney had received the federal indictment paperwork and filed an emergency motion that was denied within 40 minutes by a judge who had apparently been briefed on the scope of the case and was not inclined toward procedural courtesies. By 4 o'clock, Graham Sorrell had been detained for questioning. By 4:45, 2 members of Rourke's organizational structure had retained separate counsel, which was the specific organizational behavior of people who have calculated that the distance between themselves and the center of a legal disaster is now more important than organizational loyalty. Mara learned all of this in pieces from Dana, from a brief text from Mercer's office, relayed through Dana from the single call she took from Nolan at 3:15. Nolan's call was short. He had retained an attorney. He had completed his initial statement with Mercer's team. He was being released, pending further cooperation. He did not ask her how she was. He did not try to explain further than he already had. He said, I'm going to spend however long it takes making this right. She said, I know. She hung up. She did not know if Nolan would make it right. She did not know what right would look like, practically, for a man in his position. But she had meant what she said not as reassurance, but as the genuine acknowledgement that she believed he would try, which was the most she could honestly say and more than she'd believed 6 hours ago. At 5:20 p.m., Victor Rourke was arrested at his office building in the Loop. Mara was in the Foundation's office when it happened. Her staff had arrived that morning at 8:30, not knowing anything about the crisis that had been unfolding around their building, around their organization, around the 14 years of work that the woman in the corner office had spent the last 11 days fighting to protect. They had done their work, they had sent emails and made calls and reviewed grant applications and done all the ordinary things that an organization does when it is functioning, the way it was designed to function. Mara had watched them from her office doorway, at one point during the afternoon, not obviously, not long enough to be noticed, and had felt something she didn't have an immediate word for, something that was close to the feeling her father described when he talked about teaching. The specific satisfaction of watching something you built work the way you intended, without you having to hold every piece of it in place. She went back to her desk and opened the expansion proposal she'd been looking at before everything began. She read 3 pages before her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. Area code 312. Different number from the morning's call. She answered with a specific readiness of someone who had spent the day receiving information and had not yet reached the point of declining to receive more. Miss Ellison, a woman's voice, measured, professional. My name is Carla Bassett. I'm a communications coordinator with the Illinois Attorney General's office. I'm calling to let you know that the emergency motion to dismiss the Foundation Governance Challenge has been filed and is expected to be granted within 48 hours. We wanted you to be informed directly. Thank you, Mara said. Additionally, the Corvane Community Partners registration has been suspended pending investigation. Any organizations that received communications from that entity in the past week are being notified by our office. I appreciate that. A brief pause. For what it's worth, Ms. Ellison, the chain of custody documentation you established this morning was cited specifically in our filing as evidence of the Foundation's procedural integrity. It was the attorney on the case asked me to convey exactly what was needed at exactly the right time. Mara said thank you again, and the call ended. And she sat in her office on the 14th floor of a building in the South Loop and looked at the expansion proposal in front of her and did not immediately return to reading it. She was thinking about a parking structure on Aberdeen, about a man in a coat he'd bought recently, because buying things was how he managed the feeling of losing ground, about a diner on Milwaukee Avenue and a booth and cold green tea In the first moment, she'd understood the shape of the trap. She was thinking about 11 days. She had not reunited with her husband. She had not forgiven what needed forgiving. She had not resolved any of the things that had broken between them over 14 years, because those things do not get resolved in 11 days, or in 11 months, or sometimes ever, and she was clear-eyed enough to know which category her marriage likely fell into. But she had done something. She had stood in a parking structure and heard a confession from a man she'd trusted and chosen, in that moment, to use him productively rather than respond to the betrayal. She had gone into a building where 2 of Rourke's men were watching the entrance and gotten out again with the documents that mattered. She had made the call to Lucian that asked him for the things she had no right to ask for and had no leverage to demand, and she had made it anyway, because the people who depended on the Foundation deserved to have someone in their corner who was willing to make that call. And Lucian had answered it, not for her. She didn't think it was for her. She thought it was for the version of himself that existed before 30 years of accumulation, before the Empire and the Lieutenant and the limestone mansion and the bourbon at 2A. She thought it was for the man who had noticed an empty glass at a fundraiser and brought sparkling water without being asked. She thought it might have been the first genuinely free choice he'd made in a very long time. She didn't know what to do with that. She put it away and picked up the expansion proposal. The proposal was for a satellite office in the Austin neighborhood on Chicago's west side, an area with significant need and almost no existing legal aid infrastructure. The proposal had been sitting on her desk for 6 weeks, not because she had doubts about the work, but because the governance uncertainty of the past several months had made it irresponsible to commit new resources. Now the uncertainty was resolving. Now the commitment was possible. She read the remaining 22 pages. Then she wrote 3 notes in the margin, picked up her pen, and signed the cover sheet with the recommendation to proceed. That evening, she called Renata Gies. She told Renata everything. Not the operational details, those would come through formal channels over the coming weeks, but the essential truth of what had happened. The approach from Sorel, the information about Tessa Vane, the fact that Renata's name had been identified as accessible, and that someone had used that assessment to make contact. Renata listened without interrupting. She was 71 and had worked in institutional settings for 4 decades and had a relationship with bad news that was neither dramatic nor indifferent. She received it. She processed it. She asked the specific questions that needed asking. "Did I compromise the Foundation?" Renata said. "No," Mara said. "You respond to an approach in the way a reasonable person in good faith would respond. The fault is entirely with the people who deceived you. I shared the board meeting date, which is on the Foundation's public calendar, effective next quarter. It was going to be publicly available within 30 days regardless." A pause. "Renata, you did nothing wrong." A silence on the line. "I feel foolish," Renata said. "I know, that's also not your fault. These approaches are designed to feel legitimate. People who are good at deception are good at it, specifically with people who have integrity, because people with integrity extend good faith by default." A pause. "It's not a character flaw to have been deceived by someone working very hard to deceive you." Another silence, longer. "I want to stay on the board," Renata said. "I want you on the board," Mara said. "Specifically you. The fact that you picked up the phone and responded rather than deleting it and moving on, that was the right instinct. You engaged because you take the Foundation's mission seriously. I don't want board members who are so cautious they never engage with anything." A pause. "I want board members who engage and call me when something feels slightly wrong." "You should have told me to call you," Renata said. "When I got the approach." "Yes," Mara said, "I should have. I'll do better about that." She meant it. The call ended warmly, in the specific way of 2 women who have been through a thing together and emerged from it with the foundation of something real, which is not always possible, but was, in this case, what had happened. 3 days later, Mara encountered Sabine. It was not planned. It was the specific randomness of a city that is large but not, in certain social circles, infinite. A Saturday morning. A coffee shop on the near north side that Mara had been going to for 8 years, and had not stopped going to simply because Sabine moved in overlapping geography. Sabine was already seated. She saw Mara first, and in the 2 seconds between recognition and response, Mara saw something cross Sabine's face that she hadn't expected to see, not guilt exactly, which would have been the obvious emotion, and not defiance, which would have been the defensive one, but something rawer than either. Something that looked like the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a thing they don't know how to put down. Mara ordered her coffee. She could have left. The door was 6 steps behind her. Nobody would have thought less of her for it, not Sabine, not anyone who understood the situation. She took her coffee and sat down across from Sabine. They looked at each other. "I didn't know about Tessa," Sabine said. Her voice was careful. Not rehearsed, if anything. Under-rehearsed. The way someone sounds when they've been waiting for a conversation and still aren't ready for it when it arrives. "I didn't know what she was doing. I need you to know that." "I know," Mara said. Sabine blinked. She had expected something different. The expectation of something different was written across her face, clearly enough to read. Tessa's involvement has been fully investigated. There's no evidence you knowingly provided information for criminal purposes. Nolan's team and the federal investigators were both thorough. A pause. "Sabine, I'm not here to prosecute you. Then why are you sitting here?" Mara held her coffee cup with both hands. It was warm. She focused on that for a moment. "Because this is my coffee shop," she said simply. "And avoiding it because of the situation would be allowing the situation to take something else from me. I'm done letting things take things from me." A silence. "I ended it," Sabine said. "The affair. After I got suspicious of Tessa, I ended it, and I didn't. I should have told someone what I suspected. I know that. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, that I was being paranoid, that saying something would only make everything." She stopped. "I was protecting myself from the embarrassment of what I'd been involved in, and people got hurt because I stayed quiet." Mara looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said. "They did." She didn't add anything to it. Not absolution, not condemnation. Just the clean acknowledgement of a true thing. Sabine looked at the table. "I don't expect forgiveness." "Good," Mara said, "because I don't have any to give right now. I might at some point. I don't know." She paused. "What I can tell you is that I don't wish you harm. What happened between you and Lucian was between you and Lucian. What Tessa did is on Tessa." She picked up her coffee. "But what you chose to do with what you suspected, that's yours. You have to live with it." Sabine nodded. A small, precise nod. The nod of someone accepting a bill they knew was coming. "How is he?" Sabine said. And in the question was something Mara chose to hear as genuine, not romantic, not proprietary, but the simple human curiosity of someone who had been close to a person and then watched everything about that person's life collapse in the public record. "I don't know," Mara said honestly. "We don't have that kind of contact anymore." She finished her coffee. She left first. On the sidewalk, she stood in the November air. It was cold, the kind of cold that had stopped being temporary and was now simply the condition of things. And she breathed, and she did not feel the particular ache she'd been expecting to feel after that conversation. She felt instead a kind of clarity that was not comfortable but was honest. And she had learned over the course of her adult life to prefer honest discomfort to comfortable dishonesty. She walked home. 6 weeks after the morning on Michigan Avenue, a handwritten letter arrived at the Foundation's office, addressed to Mara personally. It was postmarked from a small town in Colorado that she had to look up because she didn't recognize the name. The letter was 4 pages. She read it at her desk on a Tuesday afternoon with the door closed, which was unusual for her. She typically kept the door open during working hours as a signal of availability. But this was a different kind of reading, and she gave it the space it required. Lucian's handwriting was not what she would have predicted. She had seen his signature thousands of times on documents she'd placed in front of him, but his actual handwriting, the casual, unguarded version, was smaller than she'd expected. More careful. He wrote with the deliberate quality of someone who had learned to type early, and was now, in the absence of devices, rediscovering what his hand knew. He told her about the town, about an apartment on the 2nd floor of a building that had a view of mountains she described, self-deprecatingly, as something he'd previously only seen as a screensaver. About the property management company and the man who owned it, who, as Lucian put it, valued him simply for showing up, which was a novel experience in a way that continued to surprise him. He told her about making his own coffee, about going to a grocery store without anyone preceding him or following him. about the particular strangeness of being an ordinary person in a place where no one knew his name or his history, or the weight of either. He wrote about the Foundation. He had read news coverage of the Rourke indictment and the governance challenge dismissal and the Foundation's statement of continued operation. He wrote that, reading it was the first time in the process that he had felt something other than the grinding logistics of what he was losing. That reading it had produced something that he couldn't call pride because he hadn't built it, but that was adjacent to pride, in the way that witnessing something you've been near long enough to almost understand can produce a version of the feeling. Then he wrote about the white freesia. She had not been thinking about the white freesia. She had not thought about them in years, had stored them in some category of small domestic detail that you don't carry forward when you leave, the way you don't carry forward the specific sound of a house you've left, with the particular creak of a floorboard you no longer walk on. He wrote that he had noticed, in the months before everything ended, that the housekeeper had stopped placing them in the entryway. He had not known why at the time. He had not thought to ask. He understood now that Mara had stopped ordering them, had made the quiet decision at some point in those last months that some things were no longer worth the gesture of maintaining. He wrote that he had looked them up. White freesia. What they meant, botanically. How they grew. He wrote that he had learned they required consistent attention and that without it they wither quickly, that they are not flowers that survive indifference. He wrote that he understood the metaphor. He didn't use the word metaphor. He wrote it plainly, the way someone writes, when they're not trying to be literary, when they're just trying to be true. Then he wrote, I spent most of my life believing that love meant keeping someone close. I understand now that you were never someone I had to keep. You were someone I had to deserve, and I didn't. He did not ask for anything after that. No request for contact. No suggestion of reconciliation. No question that required an answer. Just his name at the bottom of the 4th page, in the careful handwriting that was smaller than she'd expected. Mara read the letter twice. The second time she read it more slowly, pausing on the handwriting itself, the specific physical evidence of a man sitting somewhere in Colorado with a pen and paper, and the absence of everything he'd built around himself for 30 years, trying to say something true. She put it down. She sat for a moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out a sheet of her personal stationery, not the Foundation's letterhead, her own, cream-colored, without a name printed on it because she'd ordered it during the months of preparation when she'd been making decisions about what belonged to her versus what belonged to the role, and she uncapped a pen. She wrote back, not as his wife, not as a gesture toward reconciliation, not as a promise or an invitation or a signal of any kind that he might be able to build something from. She wrote as one person acknowledging another who had done a hard thing and was living with the full cost of it, which is the most honest form of respect one adult can offer another. She told him about the Foundation's expansion into Austin. She told him about Renata and the board and the conversation they'd had. She told him about the proposal she'd signed and what was going to be built and who it was going to serve. She told him that the structure was finally standing on its own, that she no longer had to hold every piece of it in place personally, that the people she'd spent 14 years trying to protect were now, largely, able to protect themselves and each other. She did not tell him. She missed him. She did not tell him she didn't. Both of those sentences would have been partially true and therefore incomplete, and she had no use for incomplete truths anymore. She wrote 2 pages. She sealed the envelope. She put a Colorado address on it that she found from the postmark, which was specific enough. She put it in the outgoing mail. Then she opened the expansion proposal again and returned to the budget section she'd been working through before the letter arrived. The numbers needed attention. Numbers always needed attention. That evening, she stood at the windows of her apartment on the 23rd floor as the city went dark below her. It was a Tuesday in December, cold enough now that the darkness came early and stayed, and the city's lights did the thing they do in winter, becoming more specific, more deliberate, each one a conscious decision against the dark. She was 42. The marriage was over, not in the dramatic sense of door slamming and attorneys and contested property, though there had been attorneys and there would be more, but in the deeper sense of a thing that has concluded its purpose and can be set down. whatever she and Lucian had been to each other, and it had been many things, not all of them reducible to failure. It was finished in the way that chapters finish, not with an answer, but with a natural stopping point after which the page is simply blank. She was not relieved by this. She was not devastated by it either. She was honest with herself that she carried grief for the version of the marriage that had been real the early years. The man with the sparkling water, the toast her father had given, and that this grief was legitimate and would take the time it took. She did not rush it or perform it or mistake its presence for weakness. What she did not carry was regret. She had stayed until staying was dishonest. She had left when leaving was the only true thing she could do. She had protected what deserved protecting and refused to protect what didn't. She had made the call that asked Lucian for the thing that cost him everything, and she had meant every word of why she made it, and she would make it again. Rourke's trial was 8 months out. The Corvane organization's assets were in the process of federal disposition, a process that would take years and produce outcomes that would occupy attorneys long after the principals had moved on to whatever came next. Nolan was cooperating fully and would almost certainly serve time. She did not know how much, and she had not followed his case with the attention she might have if she had more capacity for it. She wished him a version of what she'd said to Sabine. Not absolution, not condemnation, just the honest accounting of a person who had made choices and was now living them. Lucian was in Colorado, learning to make coffee and value showing up. She was here. Chicago below her was doing what Chicago does in December, existing with total commitment to its own complexity, the grid of light stretching in every direction toward a horizon that the darkness made theoretical. She could see the South Loop from here, and if she looked at the right angle and knew what she was looking at, she could identify the general location of the Foundation's building. 14th floor. Dark now, everyone gone home. She thought about 43 people, about the Austin satellite office and the legal aid clinics and the workforce programs and the community organizations that would show up next week and the week after and the week after that, because the thing she'd built was solid enough now to survive without her holding every piece of it, which had been, she understood now, the actual goal of everything she'd built, not a monument to her work, not an instrument of survival for an empire she didn't choose. Something that could outlast the circumstances of its creation and serve the purposes it was actually designed for. That was the thing. That was what 14 years had actually produced, underneath everything. She turned from the window. Her desk was waiting. The expansion budget was on it, half annotated. The Austin proposal. 3 unanswered emails from board members with questions about the governance documentation process. A call she needed to return to the workforce development director, who wanted to discuss a new partnership with the city's community college system. She sat down. She picked up a pen. She looked at the budget numbers for a moment, with the specific quality of attention she'd given things for, as long as she could remember not wishing they were different numbers, not approaching them with dread, just reading them for what they were, understanding the gaps, deciding what could be done. Then she began to work. Outside, Chicago went on being Chicago. The lights held against the dark. The grid extended in every direction toward the horizon. The city was indifferent, which was fine. Cities are not required to care about the people moving through them. That work belongs to the people themselves. Mara worked. An hour passed. Then 2. The building got quieter as the evening deepened. At some point, she made tea and brought it back to her desk and drank half of it without noticing. She was not happy, in the simple sense. She was not healed. She was not finished grieving or finished building or finished with the complicated work of being a person who had survived a significant thing and was now in the long, unglamorous process of figuring out what comes after significant things. She would have other hard days. She would have moments when the grief came back in the specific form of something ordinary, a coffee shop she'd been to with Lucian, a piece of music from the early years, a January morning with the same light quality as some January morning she no longer had access to in the same way. She knew all of that. What she also knew, what she could feel, in the specific physical way you feel, things that are true, was that she was here, in this chair, in this office, in this city, working on something that was real and decent and mattered to people who had nothing to do with any of the wars she'd fought to get here. And the structure was finally standing on its own, and the lights were on in every direction. And she was 42 years old, with expansion plans and communities waiting, and a life that was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely her own. She opened the next proposal. She began to read. And somewhere in a small town in Colorado, in a second-floor apartment with a view of mountains, a man who had traded an empire for the long, difficult education of becoming accountable to himself, was sitting at a small table with a cup of coffee he had made with his own hands, and he was not waiting for anything to come back to him. He was learning slowly and imperfectly what it meant to simply be where he was. They did not reunite. They did something that cost more and lasted longer. They became finally responsible for themselves. The desk lamp was still on at midnight. Mara kept working. Fade out.